Death raged in every shape. And as usually happens at such times, there was no length to which violence did not go. Sons were killed by their fathers, and suppliants dragged from the altar or slain upon it. So bloody was the march of the revolution, and the impression which it made was the greater as it was one of the first to occur. Later on, one may say the whole Greek world was convulsed, struggles being everywhere made by the popular leaders to bring in the Athenians and by the oligarchs to introduce the Spartans. In peace, there would have been neither the pretext nor the wish to make such an invitation. But in war, with an alliance always at the command of either faction for the hurt of their adversaries and their own corresponding advantage, opportunities for bringing in the foreigner were never wanting to the revolutionary parties. The sufferings which revolution entailed upon the cities were many and terrible, such as have always occurred and always will occur as long as the nature of mankind remains the same, though in a severer or milder form and varying in their symptoms according to the variety of the particular cases. In peace and prosperity, states and individuals have better sentiments, because they do not find themselves suddenly confronted with imperious necessities. But war takes away the easy supply of daily wants, and so proves a rough master that brings most men's characters to a level with their fortunes. Revolution thus ran its course from city to city, and the places which it arrived at last, from having heard what had been done before, carried to a still greater excess the refinement of their inventions, as manifested in the cunning of their enterprises and the atrocity of their reprisals. Words had to change their ordinary meaning and to take that which was now given them. Reckless audacity came to be considered the courage of a loyal supporter. Prudent hesitation, specious cowardice. Moderation was held to be a cloak for unmanliness. Ability to see all sides of a question, incapacity to act on any. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness. Cautious plotting, a justifiable means of self-defense. The advocate of extreme measures was always trustworthy. His opponent, a man to be suspected. To succeed in a plot was to have a shrewd head. To divine a plot still shrewder. But to try to provide against having to do either was to break up your party and to be afraid of your adversaries. In short, to forestall an intending criminal or to suggest the idea of a crime where it was lacking was equally commended. Until even blood became a weaker tie than party. From the superior readiness of those united by the latter to dare everything without reserve. For such associations sought not the blessing derivable from established institutions, but were formed by ambition to overthrow them. And the confidence of their members in each other rested less on any religious sanction than upon complicity in crime. The fair proposals of an adversary were met with jealous precautions by the stronger of the two, and not with a generous confidence. Revenge also was held of more account than self-preservation. Oaths of reconciliation, being only offered on either side to meet an immediate difficulty, only held good so long as no other weapon was at hand. But when the opportunity arose, he who first ventured to seize it and to take his enemy off his guard thought this perfidious vengeance sweeter than an open one, since considerations of safety apart, success by treachery won him the prize for superior intelligence. Indeed, it is generally the case that men are readier to call rogues clever than simpletons honest, and are as ashamed of being the second as they are proud of being the first. The cause of all these evils was the lust for power arising from greed and ambition, and from these passions proceeded the violence of parties once engaged in contention. The leaders in the city made the fairest professions, on the one side with the cry of political equality of the people, on the other of a moderate aristocracy. But they sought prizes for themselves in those public interests which they pretended to cherish. And, stopping at nothing in their struggles for ascendancy, engaged in direct excesses. In their acts of vengeance, they went to even greater lengths, not limiting them to what justice or the good of the state demanded, but making the party caprice of the moment their only standard, and invoking, with equal readiness, the condemnation of an unjust verdict or the authority of the strong arm to glut the animosities of the hour. Thus religion was in honor with neither party, but the use of fair phrases to arrive at guilty ends was in high reputation. Meanwhile, the moderate part of the citizens perished between the two, either for not joining in the quarrel or because envy would not suffer them to escape. Thus, every form of iniquity took root in the Greek countries by reason of the troubles. The ancient simplicity into which honor so largely entered was laughed down and disappeared, and society became divided into camps in which no man trusted his fellows. To put an end to this, there was neither promise to be depended upon nor oath that could command respect, but all parties dwelling rather in their calculation upon the hopelessness of a permanent state of things, were more intent upon self-defense than capable of confidence. In this contest, the blunter wits were most successful. Apprehensive of their own deficiencies and of the cleverness of their antagonists, they feared to be worsted in debate and to be surprised by the combinations of their more versatile opponents, and so at once, boldly, had recourse to action. While their adversaries, arrogantly thinking that they should know in time, and that it was unnecessary to secure by action what policy could provide, often fell victims to their lack of precaution. In the confusion into which life was now thrown in the cities, human nature, always rebelling against the law, and now its master, gladly showed itself ungoverned in passion, above respect for justice and the enemy of all superiority, since revenge would not have been set above religion and gain above justice, had it not been for the fatal power of envy. Thucydides, The Peloponnesian War, Book 3. No other struggle can provide such military lessons for the present as the Peloponnesian War. Of course, it was a Balkans-type mess, but also a conflict involving two great superpowers, as well as a war of terror, of dirty fighting in a Hellenic Third World, of forcing democracy down the throats of sometimes unwilling states, and domestic and cultural upheavals at home brought on by frustrations of fighting abroad. Victor Davis Hanson, A War Like No Other, How the Athenians and Spartans Fought the Peloponnesian War. What Athens was in miniature, America will be in magnitude. Thomas Paine, The Rights of Man, 1791. Greetings and salutations, dear listeners. This is CJ, your guerrilla scholar warrior and Renaissance man, in this new and ever-darkening dark age in which we find ourselves. This is episode 287 of the Dangerous History Podcast, The Mad Dream of Conquest, the Sicilian Expedition, Part 1. And I'll note that, as always, this episode of the Dangerous History Podcast is lovingly handcrafted, artisanal, organic, bespoke boutique, and 100% free of pesticides, herbicides, state propaganda, and artificial intelligence. This is going to be part 1 of what I'm thinking will most likely be a 3-part miniseries that I'm actually going to try and put out in relatively, for me at least, quick succession. And in part, that'll be because I think it has, unfortunately, a lot of relevance to current events and recent history, particularly in regard to the Israeli-US war against Iran, and it could have even more relevance if this thing doesn't stop soon, and particularly if it escalates. So this miniseries, of which this is the first part, is going to center around one particular military campaign during the Peloponnesian War between the Athenians and their allies and the Spartans and theirs. Although, of course, I will have to give a decent amount of backstory just because I cannot assume that all or even most listeners are very familiar with the Peloponnesian War. But before I get into that, I've been working really hard on this episode and the latter installments in the miniseries over the past, definitely extremely hard in terms of putting together notes and recording segments over the past few weeks, but even when I was recovering from my simultaneous bout of diverticulitis and pneumonia, and couldn't do much just because I was so exhausted and coughing and in pain and all these sorts of things for many weeks after I got out of the hospital, one thing I could still do a decent amount of was reading. And it had really struck me how much the current conflict in Iran has a fair amount of similarities to the Athenian expedition against Sicily during the Peloponnesian War. And I'm pretty familiar with ancient Greek history, in particular, the history of the Peloponnesian War. So I saw these parallels pretty quickly into the Iran conflict, and I realized that it's something that unfortunately not a lot of people today are very familiar with, even though there are a huge number of important lessons and insights that one can glean from studying this war, even though it happened almost 2,500 years ago. So I really hope you enjoy this episode, and I just want to remind you that while I do get a little bit of ad money and things like that for the DHP, this show is primarily made possible by the contributions of viewers like you. So if you appreciate my work here on the Dangerous History Podcast, please consider helping me out via Patreon, PayPal, Venmo, Bitcoin, or even mailing something helpful to my P.O. Box address, all that stuff, so that I can keep doing this. So we've got to run through some background leading up to this conflict in ancient Greece, because otherwise you're not necessarily going to know what I'm talking about unless you have also studied it a fair amount like I have. And this is always kind of the curse and the dilemma of the long-form solo history podcaster. And this is why so many of us put out episodes that are, many hours long, because, even if we start off doing mostly shorter episodes, intending to do mostly shorter episodes, it's very difficult to decide where to drop the needle on a particular story, and it's very easy to keep wanting to put in more and more backstory and context, because of course that's what helps you to better understand any particular episode in history. And so it's always a bit of a dilemma and a struggle to strike that balance of giving sufficient backstory and context that the listener is going to know what you're talking about, even if they really don't have any prior knowledge of whatever subject you're covering, but to not get so bogged down that the backstory ends up being, infinitely long, and you kind of bury the lead of what you're getting to. So, here's my umpteenth attempt to strike that balance. Whether I do or not, I suppose, is in the ear of the listener. So, some background on ancient Greece. And by the way, I made the episode artwork for this episode a simplified map of ancient Greece. It doesn't have all of the Greek city-states on it, of course, because if it did, the map would be extremely confusing and jumbled, but it's got most of the major ones, just in case, if you're not very familiar with the geography of Greece, you at least have an idea of where some of the key locations that I'm talking about in this episode are, just overall and relative to each other. So Greece is, of course, a collection of islands and peninsulas in the northeastern Mediterranean. And a lot of the Greek landscape, there's some areas that have some plains and things, but a lot of the Greek landscape is rugged and mountainous and rocky, and this is perhaps the biggest reason why for much of what we would consider the ancient period, really from the origin of the earliest Greek civilizations up through the time period of Philip and Alexander of Macedon, so for well over a millennia, Greece, even though it was mostly fairly culturally and linguistically a unified thing, it remained politically very fragmented for all these centuries. So way back, around a millennia before the story that's going to be the focus of this episode in this series, way back in the Bronze Age, two distinct, fairly sophisticated civilizations emerged in the area that we think of as Greece. One was known as the Minoan, and another was known as the Mycenaean. The Minoans tended to be more seafaring people and tended to be the dominant group in a lot of the islands, and then there were the Mycenaeans who were more dominant on the mainland and focused more on land military power and on agriculture. But then, around the late 13th, early 12th century BC, something hit that I've talked about in various older episodes of Dangerous History, known as the Bronze Age collapse, that hit pretty much all of the Eastern Mediterranean world and all of the various civilizations there, to one degree or another. Because of geography and climate and culture and things, some places weathered this collapse in such a way that while they went through some hard times, their civilization nonetheless kind of hung together intact. Egypt, for example, had that experience of the collapse. It was certainly not a great time to be in Egypt relative to the era before or the era after, but they didn't experience like a complete full collapse. The Greek civilizations of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, however, were among the hardest hit by this particular kind of Teotwaki event. And for roughly 3 centuries following the Bronze Age collapse, Greece experienced a legitimate Dark Age that in many ways seems to have been even darker and more drastic than the early medieval period in the aftermath of the fall of the Western Roman Empire in Europe that we normally associate with just, hearing the term Dark Age without any additional context or adjectives or whatever. And the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations essentially ceased to exist as civilizations in most ways, even though, there were still people living in Greece through the whole Dark Age. The area was depopulated a fair amount because of this Dark Age, but there were people living there the whole time, but they lost nearly all of whatever previous culture they had had before the collapse. And during this Greek Dark Age, there was a huge decline in population, acres of cultivation, technology, standard of living, culture. Writing was essentially lost. And our information about this period is relatively limited because it seems like almost nobody could even write in the region we think of as Greece. So like I said, this Dark Age lasted for around 3 centuries, and then after around 800 BC or so, a new Greek culture began to emerge that was distinctly different from the earlier ones before the collapse. And as time went on, this new Greek civilization began to dramatically progress again on measures that we would think of as kind of sophistication, technology and standard of living and all those sorts of things. And within a few centuries, they were arguably already surpassing the peak of the Bronze Age Greek civilizations by most measures. And in this era of recovery, the Greeks established colonies all over the Mediterranean world outside of Greece proper, including some as far away as the island of Sicily, and to the east, they established some colonies on the west coast of the Anatolian Peninsula, which is what today we think of as Turkey. And those ones in particular would lead to some conflicts with the imperial superpower of the time, which was the Persian Empire. Back during the Bronze Age, Greece was politically fragmented, but the type of government that the various Bronze Age Greek states had was a fairly centralized monarchy. But those fell apart during the Bronze Age collapse, and now in this kind of rebuilding period, the Greeks evolved what becomes known as the polis, which is a self-governing city and the surrounding countryside, mostly farmland, that it controls. This became the dominant political unit of Greece. So Greece was even more politically fragmented than under the Bronze Age civilizations, where you had these centralized kingdoms that were fairly small, but they were generally larger in geography than a Greek polis. Most Greek polis, and that's the correct plural of polis, polis, most Greek polis evolved something I've mentioned on previous episodes of the DHP, a hoplite militia system as their main form of military. And again, a hoplite is an infantry soldier equipped with heavy armor and a heavy shield and a long spear, and they fought in that phalanx formation that I've talked about when I've covered ancient Greece before. And in most areas of Greece during this period, hoplites were citizen soldiers. They mostly were farmers, not full-time professional soldiers, and they owned and kept their own weapons and armor, and evolved a distinct way of war in which these various Greek polis fought each other over the centuries. And one of the really interesting things about studying ancient Greece during the heyday of the polis is that they were all kind of different. I mean, many of them would have similarities with each other, but there was a fair amount of variety in terms of exactly how they were governed, not only between the different polis, but even looking at the same polis over time. It might go through various revolutions and things, and so it might be a monarchy for a while, might be a democracy for a while, and then go back, or, whatever. There were still some monarchies ruled by one, but then there also were what you might call aristocracies or oligarchies, and the difference between those two is sometimes debated, sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. Aristotle's view was that aristocracy, so monarchy is ruled by one, aristocracy or oligarchy are both considered ruled by few, and then there's democracy, which is ruled by many. And Aristotle considered aristocracy to be like the good form of rule by a few. So it's ruled by people with elite lineage generally, whereas oligarchy is just ruled by a wealthy elite. And in general, there was more of an emphasis in an aristocracy on things like what we might call civic virtue amongst the ruling elite. Whereas in an outright oligarchy, it's usually just the wealthiest people in the polis control things, and very often, not always, but very often, they're just, doing whatever's in their own personal self-interests, and they're not really thinking about the long-term well-being of their polis. And then, of course, there's democracy, right? Rule by the many, and what it really means is rule by all of whoever's considered the citizens of that polis. But understand that the Greek conception of citizenry, of who's a citizen and who's not, is a lot more narrowly defined than it is in the United States or most kind of modern democracies. So even in Athens during the heyday of democracy, most of the people who lived in and around Athens were actually not considered citizens. And citizenship meant you had the right to participate in the democratic governance of the polis, and it was generally tied in Athens and in every other Greek city-state that had democracy that I'm familiar with, it was generally tied as well to your military service. So in order to be a citizen, typically you had to have been born to parents in which your father was already a citizen, and you had to serve in the military, which generally meant that you had to be roughly what we would call middle class. So this meant that even in a democratic polis like Athens, most residents were actually not citizens. They did not have the right to go participate in the democratic assembly form of government. And so, women were not considered citizens in that regard. Neither, of course, were slaves. And by the way, every single Greek polis had slavery. It might vary a little bit from one place to the next as far as, how many slaves they had and exactly how they were treated and all that. But slavery was universal throughout, pretty much the entire ancient world. And then also in democratic Athens, there were males who were not slaves, but they still were not citizens. It might be because they were foreigners. They lived in Athens, but they had been born somewhere else. Or it might just be that they were born to parents that were not citizens, and even though maybe their family had been in Athens as far as, anybody could remember, they were too poor to be able to afford the relatively expensive armor and weapons required for hoplite militia duty, and therefore, since they couldn't serve in the military, even though they were Athenian residents whose families had been there for, as long as anyone could remember, they were not qualified as citizens. Now, by the time we get to the time period that this episode and this miniseries is going to focus on, things had gotten a little bit more democratic in democratic Athens, and a lot of this had to do with the growth of Athenian naval power by that time, because eventually there is going to be an alternative path for poorer Athenians who couldn't afford hoplite equipment to qualify for citizenship, and that's going to be by serving in the Navy as a rower, as an oarsman. And in that case, someone else is paying for the ship and kind of, the equipment you're using, not that there's much of it, but, your oar and everything like that. So you didn't have that barrier to entry of having to buy some fairly expensive military gear in order to serve in the military, and by then the rules had been tweaked so that you could earn citizenship by service in the Navy, which allowed a lot more non-slave male Athenians who were kind of below middle class to achieve citizenship, and that, of course, is going to have important impacts on how Athenian politics are conducted, because now politicians had to take into account appealing to these newer blocks of citizens who were different in a lot of ways from the previous batch of citizens who had been mostly farmers who owned medium to large farms and, had a fair amount of wealth and had, because they were more agrarian, they had a particular mindset and culture, whereas the oarsmen who come in as citizens later, a lot of them are just urban residents. They're less well off financially, of course, and so, what appeals to them in terms of not only policies, but just style is going to be different. So, from around the 500s BC until the time of, say, Alexander the Great in the 300s BC, this is generally considered the classical period in ancient Greek history, and this is what most of us think of when we hear the term ancient Greece. We know the most about this period in ancient Greece relative to the Bronze Age, of course relative to the Dark Age, and then also, by the way, I forgot to mention before, there is that kind of intermediate period, say from the 800s BC until maybe the 500s BC, where Greece is recovering, but it's not fully recovered yet from the Dark Age, but this is kind of like the rebuilding phase of Greek civilization. That's generally referred to as the Archaic Age. So the period we're focusing on in this mini-series, and the period most people think about when they hear ancient Greece, quote unquote, is this classical period. So already by the early stages of the classical era, two Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta, had emerged as the two most powerful poleis, and though they shared many aspects of culture, like language and religious beliefs, etc., their institutions and their ways of running things were very different, and even though they might have shared some aspects of culture, nonetheless their cultures were clearly distinct. So everybody thinks of Athens as a democracy, but it didn't become a democracy until around 507 BC. Sparta's history is hazier than Athens', largely because the Spartans didn't leave as much of a historical record, particularly in the Archaic Age and into the early classical period. But it's generally believed by scholars today that the Spartans established what we think of as kind of the distinctive Spartan form of government and organization of society a bit earlier than the Athenians got democracy. So probably sometime between the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Spartans created what we kind of stereotypically think of as the Spartan way of doing things in the Spartan government. And while we have pretty good information on the events leading up to Athens becoming a democracy, we don't have as much detail. We have the broad brush, outline kind of picture, but we don't have as much detail about how Sparta became Sparta. And there's sort of a chicken and egg debate, I think, about the relationship between the Spartan conquest of a territory known as Messenia and the people who lived there, known as Messenians, and the Spartans developing their kind of totalitarian militaristic state and the culture that went along with that. From what I can gather, it's a little bit unclear. Did the Spartans develop their distinctive system first, which enabled them to conquer Messenia and enslave the people who lived there? Or was it the other way around? Did they win a war against Messenia and enslave those people, and then evolved the distinctive Spartan system and culture as a way to maintain that conquest? My guess is it was probably a little bit of both. They probably started developing a rather militaristic and warlike culture and system, which enabled them to conquer Messenia. And then they probably, pushed that system even further in the direction of militarism and all that as a way to hang on to the conquest of Messenia. By the way, just as a side note, I should mention that in ancient Greece, like I said, slavery existed everywhere, and most of the slaves would have been other Greeks, who in one way or another ended up in a position of slavery. Americans in particular seem to just be conditioned because we're generally educated in a very tunnel-visioned view of history that mostly focuses on our own history, and it's usually, a bunch of propaganda with significant lies by omission and important things left out. But whatever warped propagandistic history that most Americans do receive is generally like 90% just focused on America. And so, not explicitly, but just sort of by implication, I think a lot of Americans kind of in their heads, even if it's just implicit, they sort of just always associate slavery with racial differences. But in reality, it's been very common throughout thousands of years of human history for people to have slaves who are actually the same, race, quote unquote, as they are. And while it's never great to be a slave, for sure, there certainly are worse and less bad, times and places to be a slave, because slavery is not the same thing throughout history. And in Greece, because of the political decentralization and all these fairly small independent polities existing, slavery could vary quite a bit in terms of the conditions, the punishments, the rules regarding slaves, etc., from one place to another, even during the same time period. And the Spartan form of slavery that they inflicted primarily on the Messenians was, as far as I know, the most brutal and totalitarian form of slavery in ancient Greece, and arguably one of the most brutal and totalitarian forms of slavery that has ever existed in recorded human history. So I won't get into huge detail about Spartan culture and, how Spartan citizens were raised, etc., etc. I'll assume that most people are at least vaguely familiar with that overall concept. But you have to keep in mind that even more so, like I said with Athens, most of the people who lived in and around Athens were actually not Athenian citizens for one reason or another. And same thing with Sparta, but more so. The percentage of Spartans who were actually truly Spartans, or like kind of full Spartans or Spartan citizens, was quite small in the area that they ruled and controlled. In the part of Greece that the Spartans ruled over, a big majority, varying at times, but probably typically going between like maybe 75 and 90% of the people who lived in their territory were enslaved peoples who became known as helots. Most of them were the descendants of the Messenians, whom the Spartans had conquered, although there would have been, various other enslaved Greeks mixed in amongst the helots in Sparta as well. And they essentially had no rights. And one of the many things that bothers me in the movie 300 is that I don't think it ever even kind of like mentions in any way or depicts in any way that helots existed. And a lot of times when people have these very kind of like rosy images of Spartans and, they were so disciplined and so, possessed of patriotism and all these sorts of things, and they were so brave in battle, a lot of times people don't really understand how horrific the system of helot slavery was, and that in part that was what enabled the actual Spartan citizens to live the way they did. So yes, the Spartans had these, very high quality, very well trained and disciplined and brave infantry soldiers, but the main reason they were able to do that to a degree that most other Greek poleis could not was that Spartans were able to kind of like be full-time, training for war, because they had helots, brutally oppressed slaves, doing almost all the work. And yes, if you went over to Athens to their agricultural areas, there would be some slaves who were working on people's farms and whatever, but nonetheless, the Athenian hoplites were not full-time professional soldiers who trained all the time. They were people who were primarily farmers and, maybe some like artisans and small businessmen from the city too, mixed in, but they were primarily farmers. And yeah, even if they did own some slaves, if they were a wealthier farmer and they did own a few slaves to help them around the farm, they still had to do a fair amount of work themselves. And so, the Spartans are impressive, but that was built on brutality against the helots. And interestingly, despite the fact that they quickly developed a reputation as having the best hoplites in Greece, or some of the best, the Spartans were historically reluctant to get into wars too often. Particularly, they did not like to intervene significantly in wars that were far from home. And a big reason for this was that the Spartans always wanted to keep as many troops as possible ready to go on a moment's notice against the enemy within. All those helots, which outnumbered Spartans by, it varied over time, but typically helots outnumbered Spartans by 7 to 1, all the way up to 10 to 1. And so how do you keep, if you're outnumbered, 9 or 10 to 1 by slaves that you horrifically oppress, how do you keep them under control? How do you put down rebellions that did happen more than a few times throughout the centuries of Spartan history? How do you keep those people in line when they outnumber you so heavily? And a huge part of it is you have really ruthless and really well-trained soldiers ready to go against them, the enemy within, at a moment's notice. And so even though Sparta had this, very powerful, effective, well-trained infantry force, they tended to often be very cautious in going to war for that very reason. By the way, just an interesting side note, in September of 2025, Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech in Jerusalem in which he explicitly called for Israel to become, in his words, a, quote, super Sparta, end quote. So, keep in mind that Sparta was a completely militarized totalitarian state in which a relatively small elite group of actual citizens ruled over and enslaved, oppressed, abused people who outnumbered them by at least 7-1. And Netanyahu was saying, yeah, Israel needs to be a super Sparta. Sometimes these people will tell you the truth about what they're up to. The Spartans, by the way, had almost nothing in the way of what we would consider like high culture or art, things like that. They had almost no real economy. It was very kind of basic. And for a long time, they didn't even have money. They engaged in very little actual trade outside of their own territory. For a long time, they didn't even really have money. They kind of would use like little iron pieces or whatever as like sort of fiat money. But they were very kind of insular and suspicious and like ultra-conservative, fairly could be called reactionary in every sense of the word. And really, when you study the Spartan education and training system for Spartan citizens, they were essentially trained and conditioned from a very young age to be psychopathic monsters, really. I mean, a Spartan citizen could legally kill any helot for any reason. The Spartan state had a tradition where every year they would literally declare war on the helots. And they would deliberately kind of in their own way mow the grass, just periodically kill some helots. And in particular, they tended to want to target any helot that stood out for any way or for any reason. So like even a helot that seemed, a little bit smarter than the rest, or a helot that seemed a little bit less docile and obedient than the rest. And even things as mundane as a helot who was like significantly taller than average, or better looking, or something like this, they would just cull them. The Spartans would. So, the Spartans famously had eugenics for themselves, right? They would get rid of babies that appeared to be weak or have an obvious defect or whatever. And then they had, like, essentially dysgenics for the helots. Like, they wanted the helots to be fit and healthy enough that they could keep working for the Spartans as their slaves, but they didn't want helots who were, like, charismatic or particularly smart or, more physically strong and fit than whatever was necessary to just, work on the farm. Athens was in many ways the opposite. Not only did it have a relatively much more democratic form of government than the Spartans had an interesting mixed constitution. I might mention more about that a little bit later on, but they had kind of a mixture of monarchy and aristocracy and democracy, but, only within the Spartan citizenry. And so, that would have been a very restricted group who could participate in even just the democratic branch of the Spartan three-branch government. Oh, and I forgot to mention a minute ago, another reason that the Spartans were often very cautious and reluctant to go to war outside their own territory is that there were never that many Spartans. Like, yeah, man for man, they were, better than most other Greek hoplites, but they never had large numbers of actual full Spartans. And so that made them not only, constantly worried about spreading themselves too thin away from home and the helots staging an uprising and not enough Spartans to deal with it, but also it meant that they ran a big risk every time they went to war because, yeah, they were some of the best infantry in the region, but everybody loses sometimes. And so the Spartans also would have to worry about if they did go to war and, managed to suffer a huge loss and lost a ton of their actual Spartans, that they'd be running low on soldiers very quickly. Now there were, I forget the Greek term for them off the top of my head. We might mention a bit more about them in a future episode in this miniseries, but there was another group in Sparta kind of between the helots and the Spartans, and they were kind of like not slaves, but they were not full citizens. Sort of like those Athenians who were not slaves, but were not full citizens, although in general, conditions were a bit worse for the Spartans who were in that intermediate category. And they would have been intermediate in terms of numbers as well. In other words, there would have been a lot more, even of this middle category of like free but not full Spartans. There would have been a lot more of them than of actual Spartan citizens in Sparta. But this middle group would have been a lot fewer than the helots who were, numerically like a super majority of the population of the territory controlled by the Spartans. So yes, ignoramuses and psychopaths and neocons, but I repeat myself, often will praise the Spartans and their system in a lot of ways, but keep in mind that the reason the Spartans were able to have these elite-trained full-time warriors was because a Spartan citizen had no real job other than preparing for war and waging war. Again, both on the helots inside and on external enemies. And this was only made possible because their brutal exploitation of the helots made it possible. So like I said, in most other Greek poleis, including Athens, there's some form of citizen militia military in which the soldiers were farmers, artisans, merchants, whatever, who would, in time of war, put down the tools of their trade and, put on all their hoplite kit and march off to war. And then, when the war was over, if they weren't killed, they'd come back home to their farm or their business or whatever. And Athens was so different from Sparta in lots of other ways, too. They were much more of a seafaring people. They were much more cosmopolitan. They were always much more interested in trade. Their currency dominated the region. They minted actual silver coins, and, they made a lot more stuff, and they traded with faraway places all over the Mediterranean world. So it wasn't just that they had a different form of government, like they had a completely different economy, society, everything like that, even though they're supposedly, Greek, quote unquote, just like the Spartans. So in the early 5th century BC, like 490s and 480s, Greece was actually invaded twice by the then superpower, the Persian Empire to the east. And both times they pulled off kind of big upset defensive victories that, while they never came remotely close during this period to being able to invade and overthrow the Persian, government, do a regime change, they never had anywhere near the power to even consider that realistically. But they were able to pull off significant enough defensive wins against the Persians to cause them to retreat from Greece both times. And it's not going to be until the period of Alexander the Great, centuries in the future, that any Greeks can kind of realistically think about invading Persia itself. So the victories that the Greeks had against the Persians in the 490s and 480s BC were sort of like the victory that the Vietnamese won against the US or, against France before them, or the victories that the Afghans had over the Soviets and then the Americans, where it's it's a defensive victory. It's legit. They fight off a much larger invader. They put a strong enough resistance up that invader eventually decides to just leave. And ultimately, the victorious defender is not interested in and realizes they can't, counterattack and regime change the Goliath that invaded them. But nonetheless, it's a legitimate victory that they, pulled off David against Goliath defensive win. Arguably, this is similar as well to the victory that Iran seems to be in the process of winning against the US and Israel right now. So, a little bit more detail on the Persian Wars, just because it does have some relevance to the Peloponnesian War, the focus of our story. So, the spark for the first Persian invasion of Greece had to do with the so-called Ionian Greeks, who were Greeks that lived in colonies along the western coasts of modern Turkey. And these Greeks at the time were ruled by harsh Persian-backed tyrants, and they revolted in 499 BC, and the Athenians sent some significant help. Ultimately, their rebellion was unsuccessful, but the Athenians did try to help them. Sparta, by the way, in their usual kind of cautious, reluctant to get into any faraway conflict kind of way, refused to get involved. By 494, the Persians had been able to crush these rebels and their Athenian helpers, and the Persian emperor Darius was enraged. He saw the Athenians as being like these insolent thorns in his side and decided, I can't let these troublemakers have their safe haven from which to sponsor rebellion in my territory, and so he decided, I'm going to snuff these troublemakers, and I'm going to invade Athens, conquer it, and then install my own sock puppet to rule over them, just like I already did to the Ionian Greeks. So in 490, Darius set out to invade. Darius sent a large force via ship across the Aegean Sea, that section of the Mediterranean Sea that separates Greece from Turkey, and they landed near Athens at a plain called Marathon, where the Athenians would become kind of legends. The Athenians decided that they were just going to hit the Persians hard right out of the gate, and they sent a big hoplite force that did something unusual. It kind of charged at a run against the Persians, and the Persians weren't used to fighting in this way that the Greeks fought. You can go listen to my reissued episode on the Western way of war and the Eastern way of war, obviously particularly the parts dealing with the Western way of war, to understand what hoplite battle was like. And the Persians were just not used to fighting anyone in this fashion, and they were somewhat caught by surprise. And so even though the Athenians were hugely outnumbered at Marathon, they won a decisive, crushing victory that was damaging enough that the Persians decided to throw in the towel on that particular invasion. So the Persians had been fought off and forced to retreat from their plan to conquer Athens. But they were still a huge, powerful empire. They were by no means, crippled by the loss, as kind of injurious to their pride, you might say, as it was. And the Persians did not forget Marathon, nor the Athenians' previous, sponsoring and support of rebellions of ethnic Greeks in Persian territory in Ionia, and they were determined to eventually come back and finish the job. And wiser Athenians understood this. They understood that it was almost a certainty that the Persians would make another go at it, and that they probably would devote even more resources to conquering Athens and probably as much of Greece as they could. And one of the guys who realized this and was trying to be prudent, and this is something that Thucydides is always very interested in his history, is this idea of prudence. Leaders who have the wisdom and foresight to realize, what's the wise move and what's the unwise move in a given situation, who are able to look ahead in the future to see, the likely consequences of certain actions, and to think through multiple levels of reasoning. Sometimes the thing that seems like the less smart or beneficial move in the moment is the thing that in the medium to long term is going to be way better for you. And the kind of top leader of Athens during this period was a guy named Themistocles, and he was a fairly prudent guy. And so when the Athenians struck a big vein of silver in their public mines in 483, a lot of Athenians in the assembly were essentially saying it should be used on stimulus spending, as we would call it today. And that was very popular, but Themistocles was a skillful enough politician that he was able to talk them out of it, and he said, look, we've got this unexpected windfall, and I need to remind you guys that the Persians, we fought them off one time, but they are still very powerful and, just across the Aegean, and I promise you, they are looking to get revenge for us beating them a few years ago. And so Themistocles persuaded the Athenians to spend the bulk of that windfall on further strengthening their navy, which Themistocles believed would be the most important aspect of Athens' defense when, not if, but when the Persians made another go of it. There's a story that may be apocryphal that Themistocles really kind of got this idea from the oracle at Delphi, who said something about Athens will be protected by their wooden walls, and Themistocles interpreted this to mean their ships. Well, sure enough, the Persians did make a second attempt to invade Greece and crush Athens and probably take over as much of Greece as they could in 480 BC, so, exactly a decade after the first invasion that ended at Marathon. And by this point, Darius was dead and gone, but his son, the Emperor Xerxes, decided he was going to avenge his father's embarrassing defeat by the Athenians. And he invades with a much larger force than Darius had. And the bulk of his land forces actually cross the point known as the Hellespont, the little gap between the Anatolian Peninsula and the Balkan Peninsula, which, Greece is kind of on the southeastern part of, the Persians actually built a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont and marched this huge army down, into the Balkan Peninsula aimed at Greece, particularly Athens. According to some ancient sources, this might not be, accurate factually, but according to some ancient sources, his army was so huge that it took an entire week for all of them to march across this narrow pontoon bridge. And out of the several hundred Greek poleis that existed at the time, only 31 united as allies to try and fight off the Persians, but 2 of them were, of course, Athens, and this time Sparta decided to get involved, although initially they keep their involvement somewhat limited. As this huge Persian army was marching down into Greece, this is where you get the Battle of Thermopylae that is depicted with a gross amount of historical inaccuracies in the movie 300. This is in the summer of 480 BC, and, this small contingent of Greeks, led by 300 Spartans, but including a lot more other Greeks, they held out in this narrow mountain pass for 2 days against a Persian force that may have outnumbered them by as much as 30-1. And it's only on the 3rd day that the Spartans send all of the other Greeks who were still, remaining, surviving at that point, home, and just the, 300 Spartans stayed to fight to the death, which they did. They were finally wiped out, crushed by the weight of superior numbers, and also there was a Greek traitor who showed the Persians a secret path to get around to the Spartans' rear. That is accurately depicted in the movie 300, although there's no reason to believe that the Greek traitor was this, weird mutant Quasimodo-looking monster. So the Persians did ultimately win at Thermopylae, but it was a very costly defeat for them, very much a Pyrrhic victory, and also, most importantly, and what the Greek stand there was designed to do, it delayed them significantly, which allowed the Athenians more time to prepare to deal with the Persian invasion. So in a way, you could argue that Thermopylae was a tactical win for the Persians, but a strategic win for the Greeks. As the Persians were approaching, Themistocles, again, with a lot of prudence and a lot of political skill, persuasive rhetorical power, he convinced the Athenians to actually abandon their city. He said, look, there's so many of them coming and we don't have strong enough defensive fortifications to hold them off, so we need to evacuate the city. And they did, and they actually burned, what they could on their way out as a scorched earth thing. And they retreated via all those boats that they had built thanks to Themistocles' advice to some of the surrounding islands. And so the Persians took the city of Athens, but it did not by any means win them the war. They found the city evacuated and a lot of it on fire. And ultimately, the Athenians, under Themistocles' leadership, managed to lure the numerically superior Persian fleet that also accompanied their land forces in this invasion into a narrow channel between the island of Salamis and Athens, and this becomes known as the Battle of Salamis. It is a very decisive naval battle, and it's sort of like the ocean version of Thermopylae, in which the Greeks have a lot fewer ships, but kind of like with their hoplite infantry, their ships were much more heavily built, ruggedly built for ramming and close quarters tactics, and they, kind of like the Greeks at Thermopylae, they lure the Persians into this narrow gap. In this case, it's a narrow, gap of water, the Strait of Salamis, and by getting the Persians into this confined space, they're able to nullify a lot of the Persians' numerical superiority. And it is a decisive naval victory for the Athenians that dealt a major blow to the Persian invasion. The Persian army was still intact and still large and continued to operate for a while, but it was fairly hobbled by having most of their supporting naval forces destroyed at Salamis. And the following summer, in 479, a Spartan-led Greek force decisively beat the Persian army on the plain of Plataea. And this ended the Second Persian invasion. After the defeat at Plataea, the Persians who remained pulled out. And so again, the Greeks This time, not just the Athenians and a handful of allies, as in the first invasion, but, a larger group of allied poleis, including the Spartans this time, managed to pull off this win. And I think it's important to point out that when the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta gets rolling, several decades in the future from the last Persian invasion, what you need to realize is that there's generational changes. So the Greek people and leaders who fought the Peloponnesian War were not the same guys who had fought the wars against the Persians. It's decades down the road in time. And so, some of the older guys in the early stages of the Peloponnesian War might have been sons of veterans of fighting off the Persians, if not grandsons, and by, the latter part of the Peloponnesian War, you're talking grandsons and even great-grandsons of the men who had fought in the wars against the Persians. And the generations of the Peloponnesian War tended to look back at the Persian Wars kind of the way Americans have looked at World War II ever since it ended, and kind of looked at the generations of Greeks who fought off the Persians as like their version of the greatest generation, fairly mythologized and all that. So in the aftermath of the second Persian invasion being fought off, Greece now seemed to be secure from the Persian threat for the time being, and Athens really seemed to be dominant in the region, in kind of eastern Greece, Aegean area, by most measures, but especially in terms of wealth and naval power. And they began to really kind of expand and exert more influence via a particular form of imperialism. And a lot of this imperialism was actually through trade, backed up by naval power, but not primarily built on land military power. So jumping ahead a little bit in time, in 459 BC, the great Athenian leader of that period, Pericles, who we'll talk more about later on this episode, he led an Athenian expedition against Egypt. And at the time, Egypt was controlled by the Persian Empire, obviously the kind of historic enemy of the Greeks, externally speaking, and this expedition ended in failure for the Athenians, and so Pericles at that point decided to not try to build the empire primarily through like direct military conquest, particularly outside of Greece. And instead, Pericles, who was a very prudent leader in most instances throughout his career, he changed the strategy of Athens to, in the words of historian Will Durant, quote, to win the world by commerce rather than by war, end quote. So yes, military power, particularly their navy, was a major part of their empire, but a lot of their empire and a lot of their power was built by trade. And this was a strategy that is followed by many later empires, particularly if a lot of their power is maritime. You see it with the Dutch, you see it for quite a while with the British Empire, you see it in the earlier phases of the U.S. Empire. The U.S. mostly followed this idea of winning the world by commerce rather than war for much of its history from its founding until the 1890s, with few exceptions. In the case of the U.S., this idea of trying to build and exert power through commerce instead of war, when combined with a mostly free market domestic economy and the resulting innovation and entrepreneurialism and all that, it led the U.S. to becoming dramatically the world's number one economic and industrial power by the late 19th century. By the way, this strategy of gaining wealth and power by commerce rather than by war and outright conquest is also the strategy that China has been following since at least the 1990s, if not arguably the late 1970s, when, after the death of Mao and the accession to power of the much more pragmatic Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese Communist Party adopted a relatively more free market economy internally. And, even if not actually like full free market, it's at least more pragmatic. It's less ideological than Mao's policies were. And you could argue before long, the Chinese Communist Party wasn't really communist in the traditional meaning of the word. They certainly, weren't libertarians. They certainly were authoritarians still in a lot of ways and still are. But they're not really communist for the most part, in like the old school Marxist-Leninist definition of a communist party. Now, granted, in most ways, China's internal economy in our time period is a lot less free market than America's was in, say, the Gilded Age, but still, it's been freed up enough that it has resulted in a lot of legit innovation and wealth creation. And this policy of building power and influence by trade rather than by conquest has served China pretty well. Because while the U.S. has, particularly in recent decades, been fighting constant wars, which drain the country's resources and cause dissent and political tensions and crises at home, China hasn't fought any major wars outside of its own borders in at least 50 years. And it has very little overseas military presence. But as people who travel around the world, particularly in kind of the developing world, will tell you, China has a huge economic presence in these places. And it seems like, at least for now, the Chinese leadership is prudent enough to understand that it would be stupid of them to try and follow the American example of trying to base all your power and influence on brute force and the threat of it. When that just weakens you, it bankrupts you, it creates more enemies, against you as you behave in this heavy-handed fashion. And the better way to win friends and influence people is by trade. Yes, you want to have some significant military power in case, as a deterrent and whatnot, and to actually use in the case of a severe emergency, but that, your goal should be to actually try to avoid war as much as possible. So, a little bit of a digression there into more recent history, but I agree with Thucydides that the lessons of history apply across times and cultures, to a large extent. But despite Athenian dominance of naval power and of seaborne commerce, still Sparta remained a major power in Greece with the most formidable land forces, especially when you realize that they had some allies who had hoplite infantry who were probably roughly comparable to the Spartans in quality. So, like I said before, the Greeks, despite their 2 successive defensive victories, were not in any real position to try to do something grand like invade the Persian heartland and do a regime change on Persia like Alexander is going to do, over a century later. But the Athenians still saw Persia as a big enemy and a big threat, and they were right. The Persians still nursed a grudge against the Greeks in general, but especially against Athens. And so in the years following the end of the Second Persian invasion, the Athenians still wanted to keep up some pressure against them in the Mediterranean, and they carried out some operations against some Persian outposts and client states. The Athenians also began building a genuine empire that masqueraded somewhat successfully, at least for a little while, as kind of a mutual defense alliance. They called this alliance the Delian League because for a while the kind of headquarters and treasury of the alliance was on the island of Delos. And it was officially founded in 478 BC, so pretty much immediately after the defeat of the Second Persian invasion. And this league, or empire, or occasionally in some sources it's referred to as a confederacy, was mostly centered on some parts of northern Greece, obviously including the areas around Athens, and also the Aegean Islands and Ionia, right, that western fringe of the Turkish peninsula as we think of it today. In other words, these are the places that all were still the most threatened by Persia. And as the Athenians built up their empire and got more confident in it, they gradually grew to become more arrogant or hubristic, as the Greeks might say, and more heavy-handed. As the Athenians more and more began to believe that the prosperity and security, including the security of democracy as Athens' form of government, were all dependent upon having a super powerful navy. I mentioned before that by this time, because of the importance of Athens' navy to its defense, rowers for the Athenian navy were able to qualify for citizenship, even though they were typically too poor to be able to afford hoplite armor and serve in the Athenian military in that capacity. But a poor Athenian could serve as an oarsman in the navy and thereby get the right to participate directly in the direct democracy. And so as a result, whereas prior to that reform, most of the Athenian citizenry were yeoman farmers, as Athens built up its navy, more and more of the citizenry were actually poorer people who had earned citizenship by being a rower. And that particular constituency tended to be very hawkish and very navalist in what they wanted from their democratic government, because to them, they saw the navy as protecting Athens' increasing prosperity, and they also saw navy and democracy as intertwined. Not only could the navy protect Athens from external threats that might want to snuff out Athenian democracy, such as the Persians to the east or the Spartans and their allies to the west, but also the citizens who were sailors realized that a lot of the more dovish leaders in the Athenian government were also the most kind of broadly defined politically conservative, the most kind of skeptical at best of democracy. And so the sailor constituency wanted to keep the navy big and influential so that there would continue to be this numerically large part of the citizenry who were not, oligarchs and aristocrats. One problem, though, was that Greek triremes, the main warship that was pretty much universal with some variations in design throughout the Greek world at the time, were very expensive to build and to maintain and to man. And so it was a very burdensome fiscal responsibility on the Athenian state. And yes, they did use various means to get as much private contributions to it as possible, but still it was very expensive. And when Themistocles had initially built a super powerful navy for Athens, in between the two Persian Wars, they had had an artificial subsidy provided by that silver strike that I mentioned just a little while ago. That was a temporary windfall, not a sustained, thing. And so it allowed the Athenians to build up a very powerful navy, to defeat the Persians, to start building an empire. But then it became more and more burdensome as time went on to maintain and even, increase the size of the navy. And so Athens more and more leaned on its quote-unquote allies to help pay for the costs of them maintaining a massive navy in the Aegean. And the Athenians would use the rhetoric of, it's to protect you and, to protect democracy and all this sort of stuff. And I'm sure some of their allies who were really, increasingly their subject states. Ultimately, I think Athens had something like 200 poleis of various sizes that were part of the Delian League. Increasingly, as the decades went on, more and more of the people in these subject poleis started to look at Athens as more of an imperial overlord than a big brother protector of democracy and commerce and freedom and all that. And even Victor Davis Hanson says that it didn't take very long for the Athenian Empire, aka the Delian League, to essentially be a protection racket, where the Athenians would, assess all of these contributions in money and materiel on their subject states under the guise of, we're doing this to protect you from the Persian threat or to protect you from other Greeks, outside the alliance, potentially attacking you or interfering with your trade or whatever. The Spartans had their own alliance that was known as the Peloponnesian League because Sparta is located on a piece of land called the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and the majority of their allies were in that region too, although there were some that were outside of it. And this Peloponnesian League actually pre-existed the Delian League and even predated the Persian invasions by a little bit. And it was founded as kind of a mutual defense alliance centered on Sparta as the dominant power within the alliance around 550 BC. Like I said, it was centered on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and you can look this up on a map of Greece if you're not familiar with the geography. The episode artwork for this episode is kind of a basic simplified map of ancient Greece, so you can just look at that if you want to. And the Peloponnesian Peninsula is a big peninsula that's almost an island. It is really the southernmost part of Greece that isn't a technical full-blown island that's still connected to the mainland, and it juts out as kind of the southernmost point of mainland Greece, and it is connected to the rest of mainland Greece by a very narrow spit of land known as the Isthmus of Corinth, where the city of Corinth that was part of this Peloponnesian League was located. Now, Athens and Sparta were clearly both kind of the dominant powers within their respective leagues or alliances. But in the years leading up to the Peloponnesian Wars, the Athenians were being much more aggressive with their empire, both in terms of trying to constantly enlarge it by absorbing new poleis into it, and also by increasingly, like I was mentioning a few minutes ago, exploiting the poleis within the Delian League in order to continue to build and maintain the naval power of Athens. And in the decades leading up to the Peloponnesian Wars, the Spartans were actually less heavy-handed and exploitative of their allies. They kind of acted more like just the dominant member of a mutual defense alliance most of the time, and tended not to squeeze their subject states too much, and tended, for the most part, to not interfere in their internal affairs too much, other than to occasionally maybe put down a potentially destabilizing rebellion or revolution somewhere. Whereas in the Delian League, the Athenians behaved much more like a genuine hegemon, where they were, more ham-fisted in taxing their supposed allies and in interfering in their internal politics more, that sort of thing. But something else that provides for another dimension to the Delian League versus Peloponnesian League rivalry that ultimately turned into a major war. Aside from the Delian League is centered on Athens, more of the states in it are democratic, it's based on sea power and on commerce, whereas the Peloponnesian League tends to be more conservative, aristocratic / oligarchic in their governments. They're more likely to be focused on land military forces, and with a few exceptions here and there, the Peloponnesian League states are less likely to be engaged in commerce to any significant extent. Besides those reasons for kind of the divide and the rivalry, there's another background element to it that often gets overlooked, I think, but it's important. And that is that during the classical period, there wasn't just kind of like one thing called Greeks. There were two distinct, we might call them subcultures, within classical Greece: Ionian and Dorian. And if you've only dabbled a little bit in ancient Greek history, you might be vaguely familiar with those terms, but not really understand the difference. But it's important. In the same way that if you were studying like early modern England, there's a big difference. Even within England, even excluding, the rest of the British Isles, even within England, there's a big difference, say, between the Puritans of East Anglia and the Anglican Cavaliers of southern and southwest England. So much so that, they fought a civil war in the mid-17th century. And if you've ever read Albion's Seed, kind of a deep cultural history of the British North American colonies and, how the fact that the colonies received immigrants from different parts of the British Isles had an important effect on their development and culture and politics and all that. That's kind of how to think about these two distinct groups of Greeks, in the same way that East Anglian Puritans and Cavalier High Church Anglicans, they're both English. They were both, in the 17th and 18th century, both Protestant. They technically spoke the same language, but they would have had very different accents. They would have had somewhat different religious beliefs, and just in general, a different culture that, applies to everything from their economic activity, their family life, their social structure, all these sorts of things, and many more. That's also true of Ionian versus Dorian Greeks. Now, there are notable exceptions to these generalities I'm going to be talking about, but I'll run through the generalities so you understand. The Ionian Greeks were believed to be descended from Greeks who had originally come from the eastern fringes of the Mediterranean Sea. One of the reasons why back then the west coast of the Anatolian or Turkish peninsula was known as Ionia. The Athenians and most of their allies were Ionian Greeks. The Dorians were Greeks who had originally come down into Greece proper from places to the north and west of it. The Spartans and most of their allies were Dorian Greeks. So the Dorian Greeks are the dominant group in western and southern Greece, and the Ionian Greeks are the dominant group in eastern and northern Greece. So, yeah, they broadly shared a quote-unquote Greek culture, including the same religion, the same gods, the same festivals, and at least some, but by no means all, cultural values. So again, there are exceptions to these generalities, and I will mention a few important ones, but in general, the Ionian Greeks, right, the ones that included the Athenians and most of the Delian League states, they tended to be more sophisticated and cultured and cosmopolitan, and they tended to be more interested in things like commerce and technology and cultural innovation and the arts. The Ionians gave us more of the great philosophers and art and artists and literature and dramas of classical Greece. Now, again, there were some exceptions, but in general, that tends to be the case. In general, Ionian Greek architecture tended to be more ornate and more innovative. On average, Ionian polis tended to be more interested in and tended to be better at naval warfare than land warfare. And while certainly not all the Ionian states were democracies in the 5th century BC, the Ionian polis were at least more likely to have democracy at least for some period of time than were the Dorians. The Dorian Greeks, by contrast, were more culturally conservative in general. They tended to be more kind of skittish and skeptical of change and innovation. They tended to be more insular, sometimes verging on isolationism in the true sense of the word. I mean, the Spartans, for much of their history, really didn't like having too much contact with outsiders. They worried about things like the influence of foreigners and of foreign trade on their society. The Dorians tended to be more interested in and better at land warfare than naval warfare. In general, they tended to have a more militaristic and warlike culture and outlook, and to put their military emphasis on land-based infantry forces centered, of course, on hoplite phalanxes. You could argue that Sparta was kind of the most extreme example of Dorians, and their allies were, to varying degrees, somewhat lesser kind of stereotypes of what I'm going over here. The architecture in Dorian polis tended to be more simple and more kind of utilitarian, less innovative, less concerned with aesthetics. And the Dorians tended to be much more likely to be ruled, even during the period where parts of Eastern Greece had a lot of democracies. The Dorians tended to be more likely to be ruled by some form of very elitist government, some kind of like oligarchy or monarchy or aristocracy, or in the case of Sparta, kind of a mixed constitution, but still by comparison to Athens and some of the other Greek democracies, the Spartan state was much more elitist and authoritarian. Now, there were a few interesting exceptions to these overall characteristics that are relevant to our story here, and one is the city of Corinth. Corinth was a Dorian city and was allied with Sparta and was oligarchic in its government. And yet, probably because of geography, it was a very maritime and commerce-oriented place that did have a fair amount of culture and, drama and some fancier architecture in their public buildings and stuff like that. And another important exception to these general trends I've been discussing that is very relevant to the story I'm telling here is the city of Syracuse, which was a Greek-populated city on the east coast of Sicily. And Syracuse was also Dorian, but it was founded by Corinthians, so already it was founded by Dorians who were kind of somewhat exceptions to the general trends of, what it means to be a Dorian Greek. And probably because of that, and again, because of geography, it's a port city on the east coast of Sicily. Syracuse also developed into a wealthy, maritime, commerce-oriented place, relatively cosmopolitan, a lot of culture and, art and fancy public buildings, things like that. But Syracuse, by the 5th century, was even more exceptional to the general Dorian trend than Corinth, in that Syracuse eventually even had a democracy installed by revolution. So even though Corinth was unusual in being a commercial, maritime, fairly cultured and sophisticated place, and even though Syracuse was an even greater exception in being a lot like Corinth in all the ways I just listed, but deviating even further from the general Dorian trend by eventually having a democracy, nonetheless, these two Dorian poleis that, you might think, well, if it's just about economy and, sea versus land power and, do you have culture and arts and whatever or not, and that's really what the Peloponnesian War is going to be about. It's no, it might be a case of, at the end of the day, blood is thicker than water. Because even though to some degree Corinth and to a greater degree Syracuse actually had a lot in common with Athens, still, both Corinth and Syracuse sided with the Spartans and the Thebans and the Dorians and the other Greeks of the Peloponnesian League. So again, ethnic differences, at least in some cases, may have even outweighed questions of political ideology and economic organization and those sorts of things. Another major component of the Peloponnesian League alliance of Sparta was a region known as Boeotia. And this was a very agrarian, heartland kind of area. It's sort of west-northwest of Athens, and it was Dorian, and it was part of the Peloponnesian League, and Boeotia included several important Greek poleis. Boeotia was not the name of a city, it was the name of the general region, and the most important in many ways of the cities of Boeotia was Thebes. Boeotia provided the Peloponnesian League with a lot of foodstuffs, but also with a lot of really good soldiers, and a lot of sources say that at least at some points in time, the Boeotian hoplites from places like Thebes and some of the surrounding countryside and some of the other poleis in Boeotia may have been comparable in quality to the vaunted Spartans. And there were more of them. There were more Boeotians and more Boeotian hoplites as a result, and so they were a very important part of the Peloponnesian League. Now, the Dorians and the Ionians, they shared a common language that we think of as, ancient Greek, and they could generally understand each other in conversation, but they did have two very distinct dialects. And so they may not have always understood each other with 100% accuracy. In general, the Dorian dialect was more simple and direct and blunt. It was also considered by the Ionian Greeks to be kind of more old-fashioned. By contrast, the Ionian dialect was considered more complex and sophisticated and much more expressive. It had a greater vocabulary, and it was much more suitable to articulating complex or expressive or even kind of poetic ideas. You can even see the difference pretty clearly in the works of the Greek historian Thucydides, where the Athenians tend to, when they're speaking at an assembly or in a diplomatic conference or whatever, the Athenians tend to give more elaborate, sophisticated speeches and, more use of expressive language and metaphor and whatever, whereas the Spartans tend to speak in much more concise, simple, direct, blunt terms, shorter sentences, etc. And in fact, we even get the word laconic, which means speech that's, characterized by being very simple, direct, and concise, perhaps even terse. And it can also be an adjective to describe a person who speaks that way. We get the word laconic from the old term from ancient Greece for the Spartan heartland, which was known as Laconia. So keep in mind these important cultural differences between these two groups of Greeks, because sometimes those seem to matter even more than economics or political ideology or whatever. Now, during this time period in the aftermath of the Second Persian invasion, when the Athenians were really building up their navy and their empire, Sparta, being geographically a lot further away from the Persian threat and being really landlocked, they didn't really have a navy, and most of their allies didn't. Corinth had a decent-sized navy, though nothing like what the Athenians had. And so Sparta and their allies were, just because of geography and everything, much less worried about the potential Persian, threat reappearing, and they tended to be more concerned about conflicts with other Greeks, as well as always with their numerically massive enemy within, right, those Helots, who did periodically rebel throughout Spartan history. And so in the aftermath of the Second Persian invasion, the Spartans and other members of the Peloponnesian League, they just were not interested in being part of Athens' Delian League, which, at least initially, was primarily an anti-Persian alliance. And the Spartans realized pretty quickly what the Athenians were up to, that what started as an anti-Persian mutual defense alliance very quickly became an empire, in which to varying degrees Athens exploited the other members of the alliance. Can't think of anything in more recent history that resembles that sort of arrangement, can you? And it did not take long for Athens to be meddling in the affairs of their subject states, even in matters having nothing to do with Persia, and they started messing around with some of the other Greeks in various ways too. And the Spartans increasingly saw the Athenians as subversive, and in a way they were. The Athenians began behaving more and more like neocons, by which I mean trying, when they could, to overthrow more oligarchic governments and install democracies in them. But of course, it wasn't all, freedom and self-determination, because the Athenians always wanted to install a democracy that would be subservient to them, right? So very much kind of Team America from World War II onward, I would say. So yeah, there definitely was not just the cultural divide, but also an ideological rivalry to the tensions after the Persian invasions were fought off, and this eventually is going to erupt into outright conflict between the two leagues, the Peloponnesian League of the Spartans and the Delian League of the Athenians. The Athenians were committed to democracy, not always very consistently, but very much rhetorically and at least a lot of the time in practice. And they were proud of their democracy, and they wanted democracy to spread throughout the Greek world. The Spartans, on the other hand, these Dorian Greeks, more conservative and elitist, they were much more committed to stability and to doing everything possible to prevent things like revolution and democracy from taking place anywhere in or near their league. For obvious reasons, right? I mean, Sparta is a place where a tiny minority of actual Spartans brutally rules over a huge majority of enslaved helots For obvious reasons, those Spartans are pretty allergic to the idea of things like democratic revolutions. But like I alluded to earlier, prior to the Peloponnesian War breaking out, the Spartans tended to be much more cautious and defensive-minded in this ideological war in Greece than were the Athenians. The Athenians were much more kind of on offense. So prior to the Peloponnesian War actually breaking out, the Spartans generally weren't super gung-ho about trying to regime change existing democracies into like oligarchies or dictatorships or whatever. Now they're going to get a little bit more into that game once the Peloponnesian War is going. But in general, prior to the Peloponnesian War, and even for much of the war itself, the Spartans tended to be much more cautious and conservative in the broad sense of the word in their foreign policy. The Athenians were the ones who, in the decades leading up to the Peloponnesian Wars, tended to be the more kind of aggressive and proactive, the ones rocking the boat in trying to spread their preferred system throughout the Greek world. But of course, over the course of the Peloponnesian War, which was very much a multi-generational conflict, both sides do not always stick rigidly to all aspects of their stated ideology, let's just say. I mean, the Spartans eventually are going to get very comfortable with trying to regime change democracies into oligarchies and dictatorships, and the Athenians are eventually going to become totally comfortable with waging war against democratic states if those democratic states don't want to join the Delian League and side with Athens in the war. Because the truth is, and the great Greek historian Thucydides understood this, 2,400 years ago, the thing is that the longer a war drags on, the more both sides to it will be corroded by it. And they will gradually lose their principles, their scruples, their morals, their taboos, and sooner or later they'll start significantly deviating from their own stated ideology. The longer a war goes on, the more it has these corrosive effects. And the Peloponnesian War was a long, messy, intermittent, multi-generational war. So it has a lot of corrosive effects on society. And not just the war directly, but second-order effects of the war. Like, for example, something I'll talk about more shortly. Early in the Peloponnesian War, Athens suffers a horrible plague epidemic in the city. It's directly attributable to the war and the strategy that the Athenians followed in the early stages of the war, and their failure to make adequate preparations for certain things, but the plague in Athens has an effect on like every aspect of their society and politics and so forth that is really hard to overstate. And I think it's pretty clear beyond debate that had Athens not gotten into this war with Sparta, that plague would not have happened. And as a result, not only would lots more people have lived, but a lot of damage was done to the psychology and culture and politics of Athens because of the effects of that plague. Thucydides understood 2,400 years ago that war is a messy, chaotic Pandora's box. And so it was always very risky. Now, Thucydides was no pacifist. He was actually an Athenian general for a while, but I think he understood that war should not be entered into lightly, and if you are going to go to war, you should have proper plans and preparations for what you're going to do, for any of the likely contingencies, and that certainly it is not a good thing for any society to be engaged in war for an extended period of time. By the way, different part of the world, roughly the same time period, not exactly the same time period, but roughly the same time period, the great Chinese military genius Sun Tzu understood this as well. In Art of War, he talks about how wars that last a long time do not end well, even for the victor. And in Volume 2 of his multi-volume Story of Western Civilization, the volume is entitled The Life of Greece, historian Will Durant titled his chapter on the Greek Peloponnesian War, The Suicide of Greece. And I think that's an apt description. It certainly was the suicide of classical Greece as we think of it, as the civilization of the 5th century BC. So let's get into that war. So now, after all that backstory and world building, we're going to finally get into the Peloponnesian War. Because in reality there were two. So there was one conflict that ran officially from 459, though it started a little bit before that. It officially ran from 459 to 445 BC, and then war broke out again between the Delian League and the Peloponnesian League in 431 BC and lasted all the way to 404 BC. So you have a first conflict that lasts roughly 15 years, then you have roughly 15 years of peace, at least mostly, and then you have a second full-on war that lasted for about 27 years. And even within the two kind of defined wars, there were periods of like truce, ceasefire, attempts at peace that just didn't last very long. Now, the focus of this miniseries is going to be primarily, especially in the next episodes in the series, on that second war and on a particular campaign that happened kind of right in the middle of the second war. And there's a little bit of disagreement in terms of terminology with these two wars. Some historians and some sources really consider, quote-unquote, the Peloponnesian War proper to be really only the second one, the 431 to 404 conflict. And certainly that war is the longer, bigger, costlier, more complex, and arguably, I think most people would probably agree, the more interesting one. And it is what, for example, the first great book about the conflict, the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, is almost entirely focused on, though he does, give some backstory. So first, I'm going to try to relatively quickly explain what is sometimes referred to as the First Peloponnesian War, the one that lasted from, depending on which source you consult, it started in either 460 or 459 BC and officially ended with a treaty in 445. And this era, and really several decades after and into the early years of the Second Peloponnesian War, the bigger one that often just gets called the Peloponnesian War, is dominated by the kind of towering historical figure of Pericles. Pericles was really the dominating force in Athenian politics from roughly around 461 BC, when he would have been in his 30s, until his death in 429 BC, just a couple years into the Second War. And he's pretty much universally, I think, considered the greatest leader in classical Athens in all of that, period of its history. And a very strong case could be made that he's probably the greatest Greek leader in the entire classical era. Modern historian Donald Kagan describes him as follows, quote, "He was an aristocrat of the bluest blood, son of a victorious general and hero of the Persian War. The family tradition was populist, however, and Pericles emerged as a notable figure on the democratic side early in his career. At about the age of 35, he became the leader of that political group, an informal but powerful position that he held for the rest of his life. To that position, he brought extraordinary powers of communication and thought. He was the foremost orator of his time, whose speeches persuaded majorities to support his policies and whose phrases rang in Athenian memories for decades, to be preserved for millennia afterward. Rarely has a political leader had the benefit of such serious intellectual training, associations, and tastes. Such qualities made him appealing to the upper classes, while his democratic policies and other rhetorical skills won him support of the masses. His extraordinary character helped him to win election after election over 3 decades and made him by far the most powerful political leader in Athens on the brink of the Peloponnesian War." End quote. So, while there weren't really anything that resembles political parties as we think of them today in ancient Athens, there were still factions. And most of the time there were broadly 2 factions. There were those who favored policies that sought to protect and even kind of increase the democratic nature of Athens, that were more kind of populist. And there were those who felt the opposite way, who wanted to prevent any further democratization, and some of whom were fully reactionary and really would have preferred to just undo democracy and have some form of oligarchy. And it could get very divisive and very heated, but Pericles was uniquely able to, not always, but often, bridge the gap. Because like Hagen was saying, in terms of his background, his overall manner, his education, his personality, he was definitely an aristocrat, and yet he mostly favored democratic policies and was often able to, in terms of rhetoric and style, appeal to both groups. But despite his dominance of Athenian politics for decades, which included, by the way, the fact that he was elected as one of Athens' generals every year, I think consecutively for decades in a row. Kagan points out that Pericles nonetheless, quote, never had any greater formal powers than the other generals, and never tried to alter the democratic constitution. He was still subject to the scrutiny provided in the constitution, and required a vote in the open and uncontrolled assembly to take any action. Pericles was not always successful in obtaining support for his causes, and on some occasions his enemies persuaded the assembly to act against his wishes. Nevertheless, it would be accurate to describe the Athenian government on the eve of the war as a democracy led by its first citizen. End quote. But as Kagan again emphasizes, Athens during the age of Pericles, quote, always remained a thoroughgoing democracy in every respect. End quote. So, while of course not everybody liked him or agreed with him, he was, again, probably about as close to being universally respected, at least, as it was possible for any citizen of democratic Athens to be. Something kind of like a natural aristocrat in the truest sense of the word. A guy who mostly got his way on policy, but did so without any kind of coercion or any kind of special powers other than his own powers of intellect and oratory and persuasion. And aside from building up Athens' navy during the era leading up to the Peloponnesian Wars, he also got the Athenian citizens to fund and build what would be some of the most iconic structures in ancient Athens, including the Parthenon. And Pericles was also the main man behind another major Athenian construction project, one that was less about aesthetics or religion or civic virtue, but one that was of maybe a more practical sort. And that was building the massive defensive fortifications that became known as the Long Walls. The actual city of ancient Athens was not directly on the coast, which might seem a little bit weird for a city that was the capital of a maritime empire, but the port was actually like a separate little thing a bit of a distance away. Athens' main port was called Piraeus, and it stood a little over 6 miles from the city of Athens itself. Now, during peacetime, or during a sort of typical limited, short-duration, hoplite decisive battle type of war that characterized wars between the Greek cities prior to the Persian invasions, this wasn't really a big problem. But if, say, you were to fight a long war of attrition, using naval power as your main weapon, and you were fighting against an opponent that couldn't really match your naval power, but who had the potential to greatly overpower you on land, the fact that the port of Piraeus was like 6 miles from Athens itself presented a bit of a problem. Because it meant that you would need very strong defensive fortifications, not just around the city itself to protect it, but you would also need them to protect your port, 6 miles away, and you would also need these fortifications to protect the route, the corridor, from the city to the port. So that in this scenario, you could continue to import food and other necessities and, send your navy in and out as needed, even if you were under siege by land. Pericles was wise enough, even though for a while he was trying to avoid outright war against Sparta. He was wise enough to see that it was at least, a fairly likely thing that might happen despite his best efforts. And he was intelligent and prudent enough to realize what form the war would likely take. So this is where the long walls would come in. They would protect not only Athens itself, but they would protect the port of Piraeus from any landward attack. And equally crucially, they would connect the city to the port. So they would create a wide protected corridor so that it was safe for people and goods to move, back and forth between the port and the city. And these were quite formidable defensive walls by the standards of back then. The foundations were of limestone and the upper parts were made of bricks. And they had towers at regular intervals along them for surveillance and defense. In total, about 17 miles worth of walls were built to, again, encircle Athens, but then have a corridor protected by walls going to Piraeus and encircle Piraeus itself on all the landward sides. And based on the information we have, in terms of height, they were around somewhere like 25 to 30 feet high. Built solidly enough that they could withstand most of the kind of siege technologies and things that the ancient Greeks had available at the time. The building of the long walls began in 461 BC, and they were completed within 5 years. Now, sometimes defensive military innovations, even ones that end up being kind of game changers, aren't as obvious to observers when they first come into being as offensive military innovations often are. But defensive innovations, every bit as much as offensive innovations, can often make a major difference to how wars play out and what tactics and strategies do and don't work, and ultimately they can make the difference between who wins and who loses major wars. Currently, Iran's strong defensive capabilities are an example of this. Though they're carried out by very different means and much more high-tech than the Athenian long walls, in some ways I think you could make a strong case that Iran's defenses are very analogous to the long walls of Athens. So I would say that, like Iran's defensive missile and drone capabilities, and unlike the French Maginot Line in World War II, the Athenian long walls in their time were a very effective defensive innovation that the opponents of Athens were not able to defeat for a very long time. In fact, it's not going to be for over 50 years, most of which was characterized by large-scale war, that the long walls finally failed to protect Athens. Historian Victor Davis Hanson says of Athens' long walls that they, quote, were the most revolutionary development in the history of Greek strategy. At a single stroke, the fortifications provided immunity from the age-old tactic of attacking agriculture to prompt pitched battles or induce starvation through the burning of a dry grain crop. With the long walls, Pericles had vastly expanded on Themistocles' earlier achievement, end quote. Hansen continues, saying that Pericles, quote, grasped that with the proper fortified lifeline, only the countryside, not the city proper, needed to be evacuated before the onslaught of a superior enemy, end quote. However, there were some potential downsides with this new strategic possibility, as Hansen points out. He says, quote, this was a brilliant twist, perhaps, but also utterly ruthless and divisive in abandoning the property and livelihood of thousands of citizens to the enemy, end quote. And he's referring to some of the social and economic and political side effects of using this kind of defensive attrition strategy of, if Athens were to be invaded by a major army that they couldn't meet in open battle and have any chance of success, hunkering the entire Athenian population, including those who did not normally live in the city itself, those who normally lived on the many farms in the surrounding countryside, potentially for months at a time while an invading army of Spartans and other Peloponnesians rampages around trying to destroy farms and that kind of thing. The people who are, in the city for shelter and protection, who normally lived out on those farms that they owned, they're going to be a lot less patient with knowing that there's an invading army rampaging around, potentially destroying their farms and homes, than people who already lived in the city anyway. But more on all that a little bit later. Even the Spartans, who were, in general, with the occasional noteworthy exception, really kind of unsophisticated, we should say, charitably, in their strategic thinking, realized eventually that these long walls enabled the Athenians to just avoid, to just choose not to engage in the kind of traditional hoplite battle paradigm that the Spartans and their allies, particularly the Boeotians, were very good at. And the Spartans tended to view the long walls and the strategy that Athens would use to take advantage of them as almost kind of like unfair or cheating. And some of the Peloponnesians were even, from the time Athens started building these fortifications, uneasy and even fearful, because some of the more perceptive among them realized the potential this had to enable Athens to abstain from engaging in a typical hoplite decisive battle. Victor Davis Hansen writes, quote, Sparta and her allies later complained that the construction of such extensive fortifications had changed the very strategic calculus of Greece itself, giving one state unfair immunity from traditional pitched battle, and thus should never have been allowed to happen. No wonder they hired flute players to mark their destruction at the war's end. End quote. And that last line is a reference to what happens when the Spartans finally win the Peloponnesian War, or the Second Peloponnesian War, the one that lasts 27 years of very costly but indecisive conflict. One of the penalties that the Spartans inflict on Athens is the destruction of the long walls, and yes, as Hansen says, even the normally very stern and stoic Spartans turned the event into somewhat of a party, hiring musicians to play while the walls were destroyed. And it sort of reminds me the way that the Spartans saw the long walls as a threat, right? Even though, you might argue against seeing it that way. Well, these are just defensive. How can they really be a threat to you? But they saw that it changed the strategic calculus, the balance of power. And it reminds me of how the Russians, for the past few decades have been uneasy anytime that NATO has moved supposedly defensive armaments closer to Russia's borders. And the US and the rest of NATO would be like, well, yeah, we're putting these new missiles, in our newest members that are like almost on your doorstep, but these are just defensive things. These are just defensive, missiles to shoot down your missiles. So, why are you so worried? And of course, the Russians were concerned about it, in part because at least some of those weapons could easily be used offensively as well as defensively, but also just because it changed the strategic balance of power. If the NATO militaries are able to nullify a lot of Russia's military capabilities in this way, this means that they will then be potentially emboldened to be more aggressive towards Russia and less interested in or willing to take Russian concerns seriously. But anyway, getting back to ancient Greece. The proximate seeds of the war that ran from about 459 to 445 BC were sown over the course of several years leading up to the war. A major milestone leading to the war, even before the Athenians started building the long walls, came in 465 BC. That year, Sparta experienced a major uprising of Helots. The Spartans appealed to their allies for help in crushing this rebellion, and at the time, even though you already had these two, kind of rivalrous alliances, the Peloponnesian and Delian Leagues, still, technically speaking, in kind of a legalistic sense, Athens was still an ally of Sparta because of an agreement that had been made back during the Persian invasions. So when Sparta put out the call, hey allies, send forces if you can to help us put down our Helots, the Athenians actually did send a rather large hoplite force to help them. But when these Athenian hoplites arrived, the Spartans actually kind of snubbed them. They kind of said, no thanks, you guys can go home. They accepted help from some of their other allies, but they told the Athenians, nah, we don't really want your help on this one. And what was going on is they were ideologically worried. They were worried that the Athenians might have a negative effect. Their mere presence might cause the hoplites to radicalize even further and, encourage them in democracy. And in fact, that the Athenians, not only would their mere presence potentially encourage the Helots to keep revolting, but they didn't even trust that the Athenians wouldn't ultimately take the side of the Helots and help them overthrow the Spartans and establish some kind of democracy there. As far as I know, I don't think the Athenians had explicit plans to do something like that, but it wasn't outside the realm of possibility. In other words, it wasn't a completely unreasonable fear on the part of the Spartans. And not only did the Spartans turn the Athenians back and say, no, we don't want your help, but they also kind of formally ended that old alliance with Athens. In response to these developments, Athens made a new alliance with Argos, a polis that was a longtime enemy of Sparta. Then, when Corinth and Megara, who were both allies of Sparta, went to war with each other, Sparta chose to stay out of it. They saw it as, it's a fight between two cities that are allied with us, we don't want to take sides. But when Megara, which was a city in a very strategic location, started to lose this war with Corinth, they reached out to Athens for help. And now that Athens and Sparta, thanks to, what had happened in regard to the revolt of the Helots, were no longer in this, it's complicated, we're frenemy allies type of relationship, but we're in fact formally now no longer allies and really getting to be more and more hostile rival powers. Given those circumstances, it meant that any city that was inside of either alliance that became unhappy with its situation or with its respective hegemon could appeal to the other hegemon for help and potentially join their side. In other words, switch sides in the divide. Which made things suddenly seem very unstable and volatile, potentially throughout much of Greece. And of course, the Spartans always tended to be more instinctively fearful of change and instability than the Athenians. So the Spartans especially felt like the balance of power between Sparta and Athens and their spheres of influence and their alliances was being upended. And the Athenian construction of the long walls just added to this paranoia on the part of the Spartans. And not only was Sparta unhappy with Megara switching sides and joining up with Athens, Corinth, a wealthy city that was one of the more powerful members of the Peloponnesian League, was even more disgruntled. Various proxy wars and smaller military operations and campaigns and things began to happen. And pretty quickly, things escalated into a fairly large and messy, intermittent 15-year war that was costly to both sides and only seems from today's perspective relatively small, or at least relatively not so large, by comparison with the next Greek versus Greek war. Eventually, after about 15 years of indecisive conflict, the Spartans decided to try to win it in one big push, and they put together a very large army of Peloponnesians and marched them into Attica, the region around Athens, to try to seek a big decisive battle and win the war. But ultimately, that battle never happened. The Spartans turned around and marched home before they ever got an opportunity to fight that battle. Some sort of deal seems to have been made to cause the Spartans to, not long after marching this big army into Attica, turn around and march out. And we don't have really detailed, hard evidence on what exactly happened. But it seems that most likely Pericles somehow communicated with them and made some sort of a deal that persuaded the Spartans to call it off. Almost something analogous to JFK and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both kind of stepping up to the brink and then stepping back from it once they really started to wrap their heads around where this could go. In other words, it seems like probably both Pericles and the Spartan king at the time, Pleistonax, both blinked when they were actually staring down the barrel of what could happen. Perhaps the Spartans decided that even if they could goad the Athenians out into open battle, and, even though probably they would win, it would be a very costly victory, and the Spartans were always kind of cautious about losing too many of their own Spartans, of their own elite citizens. They were such a limited number that most of the time they tended not to expend large numbers of them. This is part of why the Spartan contingent that was sent to Thermopylae back during the Second Persian invasion was only 300. It's also possible that part of the reason for this climactic battle never taking place was that by this point, of course, Athens' long walls had been completed for a while. And so it's also possible that Pericles might have gotten a message out to the invading Peloponnesians and told them, hey, look, we're not going to come fight you in a decisive battle. We're going to play defense behind these walls and good luck overcoming that. And maybe once the Spartan king really kind of wrapped his head around that, he decided, there's really no way to win decisively here if they're not going to come out. But somehow or other, some sort of a deal seems to have been made. And I should point out that Pericles was not only respected by most Athenians to a large extent, but he was also respected and trusted by most of the Spartan leadership, at least at this time. So he might have been able to get like a metaphorical handshake agreement for the Spartans to march out, and then they would have an actual diplomatic conference to officially end the war. And sure enough, that's what happened. An official treaty was soon worked out to formally end this First Peloponnesian War. And what it did really was recognize the existing alliances and spheres of influence between the two sides, and the treaty said that as of the signing of the treaty, no member of either alliance would be allowed to switch sides. Though it did say that neutrals, poles that were neutral as of the signing of the treaty, could potentially in the future choose to join with one or the other. And it also said that both sides would agree to arbitration in the event of any future disputes. And even at the time they wrote and signed it, this treaty was called the 30 Years' Peace, because that's how long it was supposed to last. Though, of course, it only ends up lasting about half that long. Historian Donald Kagan describes this treaty as the, quote, sort of treaty that ends a conflict, usually a long one, in which each side has become aware of the costs and dangers of a protracted war and of the virtues of peace, whether or not an undisputed victor has emerged on the battlefield. Such a treaty does not aim at destruction or punishment, but seeks a guarantee of stability against the renewal of conflict. To succeed, such a peace must accurately reflect the true military and political situation, and must rest on a sincere desire by both parties to make it work. Over the course of a long war, both sides had suffered serious losses, and neither could win a decisive victory. The sea power of Athens had been unable to sustain its triumphs on land, and the land power of Sparta had been unable to prevail at sea. The peace was a compromise that contained the essential elements that should have guaranteed its success, for it accurately represented the balance of power between the two rivals and their alliances." End quote. So really, in broad strokes, the 30 Years' Peace was supposed to be a non-aggression pact that would last for at least 30 years, at which time, presumably, the two sides could negotiate on whether to renew it, or maybe modify it, or maybe throw it in the garbage. The leaders of both sides who actually were involved in making this treaty seem to have genuinely wanted to keep it. They had been kind of spooked by how much death and destruction and costs had already been incurred during this 15 years of war, and they didn't want it to continue, and they didn't want it to flare up again and maybe get even bigger anytime soon. But both in Athens and in Sparta, as well as in some of their major allied city-states, there were loud factions who were not satisfied. And they didn't want peace. They thought they could pursue whatever their interests were more effectively through war. And so as the peace wore on year by year, what happened was, in many parts on both sides, these hawks kept gaining ground at the expense of the relative doves who had actually made the treaty. And so a lot of the political support for the peace started to gradually erode. And on top of that, while Sparta's power seemed to have remained more or less constant during the peace, at the same time, the wealth, the power, the influence, and the resources of Athens continued to grow very rapidly during the years of peace. Because of their much more dynamic and innovative economy, and just the culture and psychology of many Athenian people and leaders. They were just always more active than Spartans, in every sense of the word. And so as the peace wore on, even many Spartans who, as I've mentioned multiple times, they were usually very cautious and, for people known primarily as these great warriors, they were often very reluctant to go to war, especially on a large scale, or for a protracted length of time, or far away from their home area. But as they watched Athens continue to grow in all these ways, many of them started to think that this continued growth of the Athenian Empire was really maybe metastasizing into what could be an existential threat to Sparta. And the Spartans who worried about this, and some of the leaders in some of their allied cities as well, increasingly thought that it would be better to confront Athens sooner before they got even more powerful. So for the remainder of this episode, I'm going to be talking about the origins of the Second Peloponnesian War, aka the Peloponnesian War, that officially started in 431 BC, when the 30 Years' Peace broke down after only about 15 years. And like I think I said a little earlier, this war is going to be much bigger, longer, bloodier, more complicated, and costly in just about every way. So for the remainder of this episode and the remainder of this little series, when I say the Peloponnesian War, this is the conflict I'm referring to. The big one that lasted from 431 to 404 BC. And if you've never studied it and don't know much or anything about it, this conflict is in many ways kind of a very modern and familiar kind of feeling war. It's been compared to many other long, complicated, costly but indecisive conflicts between competing alliances. Some relatively recent historians have compared it to the Cold War, in that you've got this complex world with two rival alliances, each headed by a powerful hegemon, who are contesting for resources and territory and all that, but where there's also a clear ideological dimension. And they're vying with each other for dominance over the course of multiple decades. Just like in the case of the Cold War, in the Peloponnesian War, you have everything from complicated proxy wars and asymmetric wars and even revolutions, sometimes from internal forces alone, but often with outside sponsors aiming at kind of a favorable regime change. In addition, you have things that you could reasonably describe as terrorism, or terror tactics at least. And all of that in addition to more conventional military operations, of land forces fighting land forces in identifiable battles, and same thing at sea. And I think there's definitely some validity to the comparison to the Cold War. And you could argue that, given the slow communication and transportation technologies of classical Greece, and given the very limited knowledge of the wider world that the Greeks of that era had, for them, in terms of their subjective world, the Mediterranean must have felt like what the world feels like to us. Just like modern Americans might think of, say, China or India as far-off places that, yes, theoretically you can travel to and visit, but it's a long trip, and most people will never make it, and the cultures there seem just so alien from what you're used to. That's how most ancient Greeks would have thought about the further away edges from them of the Mediterranean world, such as, for example, what they called the Pillars of Hercules, or what we know as the Strait of Gibraltar. The Pillars of Hercules, like India to us, it's part of our known world, but it's not very well known to most of us, and it's about as far away as you can get while still being part of that same world. And while the Greeks of the classical period were mostly pretty familiar with the western fringes of the huge Persian Empire, much of the rest of even that empire was almost like another planet to the Greeks. Now, one major difference, of course, between the Cold War and the Peloponnesian War is that, unlike in the case of the Cold War, in the Peloponnesian War, there was plenty of direct conflict between the two hegemons, the Spartans and the Athenians, and their, more powerful allies. And I think something like that might very well have happened in the Cold War too, if it hadn't been for the existence of nuclear weapons that would make even someone like Joseph Stalin reluctant to escalate all the way to direct superpower versus superpower conflict. Well-rounded, educated members of Western civilization used to be almost universally pretty knowledgeable about ancient Greek history, especially the era of the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars. A lot of well-educated people from not too long ago might have even read things like Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War in the original Greek. An 18th century or 19th century or even early 20th century British gentleman going to a place like Oxford or Cambridge would have studied Herodotus and Thucydides and Aeschylus and Plato and Aristotle, regardless of whatever other subjects they might have studied. These things were considered part of the foundation of a classical education. The American Founding Fathers would have been mostly in the same camp as would well-read Americans throughout at least most of the 19th century. Books like Herodotus's History of the Persian Wars or Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War would have been not that far behind the Bible and Shakespeare in terms of being considered almost like universal essentials of being a reasonably well-read person. Now, of course, not so much. Even at places like Oxford and Cambridge. Nowadays, what used to be considered a basic foundation of a classical or liberal arts education is mostly gone. And while there are still plenty of scholars of ancient Greece, including some pretty good ones in our time, at most universities, they're really just a specialized niche. Not something that most students are required to have at least some exposure to. And I really think we've lost something. And I'm really grateful that I went to Flagler College, which at least at the time I went there, was still to a large extent an old school liberal arts college, and that I studied history and minored in political science there. Because unlike so many other people of my generation or later generations who went to college, I ended up being exposed to a lot of this stuff. Particularly in political science, where the main professor in the department at the time was a guy who had written his dissertation on Thucydides, and who had us reading and discussing not only Thucydides, but Aeschylus, Plato, Aristotle, and other great Greek, and for that matter, Roman philosophers and historians. Now, of course, when we get into this, Second Peloponnesian War, our number one primary source for this war, by a long shot, is the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. And Thucydides didn't just study this war, he lived through it and he fought in some of it. For a while, he was an Athenian general, or what the Greeks called a strategos, or strategos. I'm not sure the exact pronunciation, but it's obviously the root of our word strategy. And interestingly, the ancient Greeks used the term strategos interchangeably for what we would consider generals and admirals. Now, some strategoi, as the plural is supposed to be, were better at and maybe specialized more on land versus sea command. Relatively few seem to have been equally good at both, but nonetheless, it is kind of interesting that they didn't differentiate in terms of terminology between a land commander and a sea commander. Like I said, Thucydides lived through the whole war. He even got the horrible plague that struck Athens in the early years of the war, which I'll probably get into in the early part of the next episode in this series. And thankfully for him and for all of us who have read and enjoyed Thucydides' work, the plague did not kill him. He also served as a general for a while in the early years of the war, but eventually he came into political disrepute and was removed from command and exiled after a failed naval operation. But like I said, he did live through the entire war and wrote a very detailed narrative history of it, known as the History of the Peloponnesian War, or sometimes just referred to as the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides is sometimes considered the first true historian in history, or at least in Western history, maybe even in world history. And sometimes people point to Herodotus, who was a generation or two earlier than him, and who wrote a detailed history of the Persian Wars. And I would say that To me, Herodotus is more like a proto-historian. Like he's almost there in terms of his overall approach to relaying the stories of the past, but he's not quite there. Whereas Thucydides is like fully, in terms of his just overall approach and mindset and analysis, he is very much a historian, properly defined. I think it is interesting, though, that Herodotus, the proto-historian, and Thucydides, the first real historian, in my mind anyway, were both Athenians. Because I think that democratic Athens was the first society in which you could have a true historian. Not only was it a prosperous and innovative enough place that there were, a fair number of very educated and literate people walking around, but also it had, by the standards of, several centuries BC, relatively speaking, the most kind of free speech, sophisticated civilization that had ever existed up to that point. And it's also important that as a democracy by that time period, Athens did not have anything like a king or an emperor or any sort of dictator. Because prior to Herodotus and Thucydides, historians weren't really historians, they were court historians. They were people usually working directly for the rulers. And so their job wasn't to accurately try to figure out what happened and, report it in writing. Their job was to write up a version of past events that would make the king or whoever was in charge, the pharaoh, the emperor, happy. Whereas Herodotus and Thucydides were not working for a king or anything like that. They were just trying to figure out what really happened to the best of their abilities and report it. And I think, again, Thucydides did it more fully than Herodotus, even though I think Herodotus is still very much worth reading and was an important kind of like precursor to Thucydides. In his own introduction to his book, Thucydides claims that he started working on writing his history pretty much at its beginning, at the beginning of the war. So, if that's true, he was basically working on it, or at least working on notes for it, almost in real time, not long after the events had happened that he was writing about. Some of them he had witnessed firsthand, others he hadn't, but again, he was a well-informed, wealthy, politically influential Athenian, so he was generally getting pretty good information, and he had lots of good contacts who could give him the story on things that he hadn't witnessed. So he generally got probably as good of a picture of what had happened over the course of the war as anybody at that time could have. And in that introduction, Thucydides also explains, writing in third person, why he felt compelled to write the history of this war and to start doing so even at its very beginning. He writes, quote, Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, beginning at the moment that it broke out, and believing that it would be a great war and more worthy of relation than any that had preceded it. This belief was not without its grounds. The preparations of both the combatants were in every department in the last state of perfection, and he could see the rest of the Greek race taking sides in the quarrel, those who delayed doing so at once having it in contemplation. Indeed, this was the greatest movement yet known in history, not only of the Greeks, but of a large part of the barbarian world. I had almost said of mankind. For though the events of remote antiquity, and even those that more immediately precede the war, could not from lapse of time be clearly ascertained, yet the evidences which such an inquiry carried as far back as was practicable lead me to trust, all point to the conclusion that there was nothing on a grander scale, either in war or in other matters. End quote. So he's saying that from the beginning, he could tell that this war was going to be the biggest conflict and the most momentous event that his region of the world had ever experienced. Unfortunately, for those of us like me who enjoy reading his work, Thucydides died under murky circumstances. There are some conflicting historical accounts, and I have no idea what the truth is. But he died around 400 BC, give or take a few years potentially. After this war that he was writing about was over, but before he completely finished writing his history. So unfortunately, his masterpiece ends very abruptly in terms of the narrative in 411 BC, when there was still 7 more years of war, that he needed to write about. So even though he lived to see how the war finally ended in 404, he didn't live long enough to finish writing his entire book about it, and that's a real shame. I would have loved to hear or read his take on those last few years of the war, which were some of the most brutal and costly. And Thucydides doesn't just chronicle events in an often compelling narrative way, he also is really a keen analyst of a lot of things, and he deals with a lot of concerns and questions and themes. Just a few of which would be things like human nature and human psychology, and the chaotic, unpredictable nature of war, and the effects, mostly negative, of prolonged war on societies. And in general, the role of chance. Sometimes you can make all the best plans, and still some random thing happens or some unforeseen contingency occurs. And despite your brilliant, diligent efforts, whatever it is you're trying to do fails. This is what they often would have talked about as the role of fortune back then. That said, he also deals a lot with the importance of prudence. And that even though no amount of prudence and wisdom and foresight is 100% protection from the potential dangers of fortune gone awry, nonetheless, prudence is the best thing we have to give whatever it is we're trying to do at least the best odds of success. He also very keenly analyzes the virtues and vices, the strengths and weaknesses of democracy, which was still, quite a new form of government at the time. Thucydides himself was very much from an aristocratic background, and unlike Pericles, Thucydides generally sympathized more with the more conservative, elitist faction in Athens, but that said, he's not always 100% negative on democracy by any stretch. But I do think that having lived through the entire war that Athens, plot spoiler, ultimately does lose, and lost, I think, in part because of some serious strategic errors compounding that, at least arguably, were due largely to the influence of democratic politics being so susceptible to things like charismatic demagogues who might be incompetent or malevolent or both. Thucydides does seem on balance to be more negative than positive about democracy. And he definitely seems to have thought that democracy worked best when there was a figure like Pericles, who was a wise, capable leader for the most part, and who had the political skills to mostly persuade the Democratic Assembly of Athens to adopt his policies. But of course, the role of chance, luck, fortune, whatever you want to call it, the general unpredictable, chaotic nature of war, you cannot ensure that there's always going to be somebody like a Pericles there who's able to generally hold the society together through the hardships of war and keep it on the right strategic path. And on this idea of the dangerous, destabilizing nature of war, he keys in on a lot of important second-order effects that often are overlooked or underappreciated and not taken into account by not-so-prudent leaders when they're thinking about whether to go to war or not, and thinking about if they're going to go, how do they do it, what's their strategy. A lot of times there are these second and third order effects that happen, particularly in a protracted war involving, multiple alliances, that can sometimes have a bigger, though not always so obvious, effect on the outcome of the war, as the battles themselves. So we're talking about things like epidemics, for example, or revolutions. And by the way, that passage from Thucydides that I read in the intro to this episode is a very famous one, in which he's describing the first major political revolution of the war, which was a nasty revolution in Corcyra, which very quickly gets out of hand and gets very bloody and ugly and chaotic in ways that often remind more modern readers of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or others of that nature. Pretty soon, it's not just a simple regime change, but a destructive upending of the entire society. And as Thucydides points out over the course of his book, these sorts of episodes become increasingly common as a protracted war drags on and on. So, Thucydides will definitely be the source that I cite and quote from the most over the course of this miniseries. Partly because, like I said, he lived through the whole thing and was in enough of a position of power and influence for most of it that he really had a good picture of what was going on. And partly because, like I said, he's just a very keen analyst of human psychology and sociology and politics and war itself. But also he's a great writer. Now, granted, I'm reading a modern translation of it. I can't read ancient Greek, but nonetheless, I've read several different translations of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, at least, in part. And while I have my favorites and some are more readable to the modern reader than others, nonetheless, it's always pretty well written. And I think it's definitely the case that if you can read Thucydides in the original Greek, it's probably, a great piece of literature, not just a great piece of history. And one of the things that makes Thucydides' work so quotable are the way he writes up the major political speeches. He himself was present for some of them, but as he admits in his own book, he kind of forensically reconstructs the ones that he didn't personally witness. And while, of course, it's extremely unlikely that the speeches he didn't personally witness are transcribed word for word, and, probably even the ones he did witness himself are not perfectly word for what was said, nonetheless, he was probably working from accurate accounts, at least of the gist of what was said. And as far as I can tell, most modern historians of ancient Greece believe that he was probably mostly pretty accurate about what was said in various important speeches in terms of broad brushstrokes. And if anything, he probably wrote them up in more literary and at times almost poetic sounding prose than was used by the people actually giving these speeches. So maybe the speeches as related by Thucydides are not, 100% technically, historically accurate in the literal sense. Again, the main gist or arguments of the various speeches are probably correct, and if anything, they're more readable. They're more literary than the real ones probably were. So it's almost like a hyper-reality thing, where by quoting Thucydides, you're quoting something like the Platonic ideal of the actual speech that was given, that conveys the same arguments, but which is actually superior in rhetoric and language. So if anything, Thucydides probably expresses the speaker's arguments even more vividly and, I don't know, maybe even more arrestingly in some cases than the real speech would have been to listen to in person if you were there. Interestingly, before Thucydides starts launching into the proximate causes of this war, the specific grievances between the different factions and cities that caused it to light up, he briefly explains his own belief about the ultimate causes of the war. He writes, quote, "The real cause I consider to be the one which was formerly most kept out of sight. The growth of the power of Athens, and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta, made war inevitable." End quote. The mid-20th century American historian Will Durant Like many other historians after Thucydides who have written about this war, largely agrees with Thucydides' analysis on this. He writes, quote, "The basic cause of the war was the growth of the Athenian Empire and the development of Athenian control over the commercial and political life of the Aegean. Athens allowed free trade there in time of peace, but only by imperial sufferance. No vessel might sail that sea without her consent." End quote. And in particular, the Athenians were always, even in peacetime, pretty heavy-handed about controlling the movement of grain in the Aegean Sea. And their heavy-handedness and their increasing growth in power spooked not only the Spartans and some of the Spartans' allies, but at times it greatly annoyed and disgruntled even some of Athens' own allies. Will Durant continues, quote, "Athens defended this domination as a vital necessity. She was dependent upon imported goods and was determined to guard the routes by which that food came. In policing the avenues of international trade, Athens performed a real service to peace and prosperity in the Aegean. But the process became more and more irksome as the pride and wealth of the subject cities grew. The funds that these had contributed for defense against Persia were being used for the adornment of Athens, even for the financing of Athenian wars upon other Greeks. Athens reserved to Athenian courts the right to trial cases arising within their confederacy that involved Athenian citizens or major crimes. If any city resisted, it was reduced by force." End quote. And in fact, under Pericles' leadership, the Athenians crushed no fewer than 3 significant rebellions in their own allied poleis in the 450s and 440s BC. Will Durant sums it up by writing, quote, "If we may believe Thucydides, the democratic leaders at Athens, while making liberty the idol of their policy among Athenians, frankly recognized that the confederacy of free cities had become an empire of force." End quote. So yeah, this thing that had been a seemingly voluntary alliance of Greek states for mutual defense and for teaming up against the Persians, right, the Delian League, it pretty quickly, within about a generation, evolved into an empire in which democratic Athens was being pretty heavy-handed. And unlike in the case of, say, the American Empire, a lot of Athenians at the time recognized this. And many of them, especially on the more populist side of the political spectrum, thought it was great. And they made no secret of it. They said the quiet part out loud. And some of these sorts of politicians would occasionally remind the assembly, almost like they're saying to not take too seriously all of the democratic propaganda. To remind them that, we're in favor of that, but at the end of the day, we're going to do what's best for Athens. So, for example, a few years into this war, Thucydides reports the Athenian leader Cleon, who was a populist demagogue and very much a war hawk, and very much in favor of the Athenian Empire, saying, in a speech to the assembly, quote, "You should remember that your empire is a despotism, exercised over unwilling subjects who are always conspiring against you. They do not obey in return for any kindness which you do them to your own injury, but only insofar as you are their master. They have no love for you, but they are held down by force." End quote. So at least the leaders and proponents of Athens' empire were relatively honest compared to the leaders and proponents of the American Empire, for example. Athens was the first democratic state in recorded history to have built an empire, and also to have built an ideological narrative of their empire around the idea that democracy was the best form of government and that they should be spreading democracy and opposing oligarchies and dictatorships around their part of the world. Sound familiar? And already, just, a couple generations or so into the existence of this Athenian empire, already they were encountering the fundamental contradiction between democracy and empire. Almost 2,500 years ago. They're already saying the quiet part out loud. The quiet part being that, the truth is the reality of empire is force and domination, and at the end of the day, this is ultimately incompatible with any genuine, consistent belief that all states should be democratic and have self-determination. The truth that an empire of liberty is a fundamental oxymoron that can't really exist. And such a thing either is going to cease to be an empire, or it's going to cease to have democracy and liberty. Because empire always requires the hegemon of the empire to do things that are in gross contradiction and violation of things like democracy and self-determination for the subject peoples of their empire. So what was happening in Athens in the mid-5th century BC with their empire is very similar to how the US claims to support democracy for every country, ideally, but then how in reality it blatantly violates and overthrows any foreign quote-unquote democracy if it opts for policies that the US doesn't like for some reason. Already, almost 2,500 years ago, Athens was engaging in that exact form of gross hypocrisy, proclaiming itself to be the Johnny Appleseed of spreading democracy while acting brutally against any state under their control or influence that went against their wishes, whether that state was democratic or not. So by the 440s BC, some of the Greek states that either were subjects of the Athenian Empire or were under threat of being turned into Athenian subjects started to reach out to Sparta because, of course, it was the only Greek state that could rival Athens in power, even though, the power of the two hegemons was of very different types. In these circumstances, Will Durant writes, quote, "The Spartans were not eager for war, knowing the strength and valor of the Athenian fleet. But the old racial antipathy between Dorian and Ionian inflamed them, and the Athenian custom of establishing in every city democracies dependent upon the Athenian Empire seemed to the landowning oligarchy of Sparta a threat to aristocratic government everywhere. For a time, the Spartans contented themselves with supporting the upper classes in every city and slowly forging a united front against Athens." End quote. So he brings up that important and often overlooked factor I mentioned earlier in this episode of the difference between the Dorians and the Ionians. And another underlying cause of the war, aside from the growth of Athenian power and the Athenians' increasingly heavy-handed efforts to be the one sole hegemon of Greece, and the fear that this provoked amongst the Spartans. One more factor was present on both sides. And it's often overlooked, but Thucydides, perceptive as he was, spotted it. And that factor is generational. 2,400 years ago, Thucydides wrote, quote, "The Peloponnesus and Athens were both full of young men whose inexperience made them eager to take up arms." End quote. And Will Durant, after quoting this line from Thucydides, calls this sentence, quote, "a sentence that explains much of history." End quote. and I would very much agree with that. It's always a volatile situation when you've got generations rising into positions of influence who don't have first-hand accurate knowledge and experience from previous nasty, ugly, protracted, costly wars, and who have mostly only heard heroic, sanitized, almost mythological stories about those big previous wars, rather than the ugly truth. And so they grow up thinking that war is a fun adventure, and nothing more than a great place to fight and win fame and fortune and glory for themselves, like their heroic ancestors had in previous wars. Pericles was old and experienced and wise enough to know the costs and dangers of war, and it seems like he genuinely was hoping to avoid reverting to all-out war with Sparta. But he was conflicted, because he wasn't willing to concede too much to the Peloponnesians in regard to Athenian naval power, because he saw controlling the commerce of the Aegean, particularly, like I said before, in regard to food, as being a vital national security interest of Athens. And so even though he would have preferred to avoid war, he wasn't willing to concede that much to avoid it, and he saw that it was increasingly likely, and he began preparing for it. Still, though, he was trying to avoid it, and he called for a conference of all the Greek city-states to try to resolve their differences through negotiations. But as Will Durant puts it, quote, Sparta refused to attend, feeling that her acceptance would be construed as an acknowledgement of Athenian hegemony. And at her, meaning Sparta's, secret suggestion, so many other states rejected the invitation that the project fell through. End quote. Like Europe in the immediate lead up to the First World War, the alliances are hardening and the tensions are rising, and diplomacy is failing and starting to become almost non-existent. And all it's going to take are some sparks to light up all of this highly combustible stuff that had been piling up for many years. It started to spark up in 435 BC, when Corcyra, which had been founded as a Corinthian colony, basically declared its independence from its mother polis, established a democracy, and immediately sought an alliance with Athens as protection from Corinth. Athens sent a fleet to help them, which fought an indecisive naval battle against Corinth and their ally Megara. Full-fledged war among the Greek polis didn't quite break out yet, but most Greeks who were paying attention seemed to have come to the conclusion that that was basically, at this point, inevitable. A few years later, in 432 BC, Potidaea, a city that had been an Athenian ally / tributary / subject, but which had originally been founded by the oligarchic city of Corinth, experienced an uprising pushing the other direction, aiming at ending Athenian control of their city. Pericles dispatched an army to crush the Potidaeans, and the result was a long drawn-out siege, with Corinth doing its best to help the Potidaeans. The Potidaeans held out for 2 years, and this was a drain on Athens' resources and was seen by the Greeks as a quagmire that really hurt Athens' prestige and reputation and caused a lot of people around the Greek world to question Athens' real strength. Things came to a head when Megara, again Corinth's ally at the time, intervened and also began helping Potidaea against the Athenians. At this point, Pericles decided that he needed to ramp up the pressure, and he ordered a complete embargo on all of the Megarian products throughout all of the Athenian Empire. For any Greek polis like Megara that was heavily engaged in commerce, this was a potential economic stranglehold. This is kind of analogous to FDR's embargoes and other economic warfare measures against Japan in the lead up to Pearl Harbor. Not surprisingly, in this situation, Megara and Corinth both appealed to Sparta for help. The Spartans demanded that Athens repeal the embargo, but the Athenians replied that they would do so only if Sparta would allow outsiders to access Laconia, which was the Spartan heartland on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, kind of their equivalent of Attica for Athens. They would only repeal their embargo if the Spartans allowed outsiders to access Laconia for the purposes of trade and commerce. Sparta, kind of like their response to the Athenians sending a big force to help them put down the Helot rebellion years before, saw this as a potential way for Athens, in their eyes, insidious, radical, destabilizing influence to worm its way into Spartan society and cause trouble. So naturally, the Spartans were vehemently against making that concession, and they countered with the demand that Athens officially acknowledge the independence and full sovereignty of all of the Greek polis, essentially giving up their empire. This was too much even for Pericles. He argued before the Athenian assembly that this would be the death of their empire, and therefore the death of their prosperity and power and standard of living, and potentially down the road, maybe even the end of their democracy. As usual, the Athenian assembly was persuaded by Pericles, and they voted to refuse the demand of the Spartans, and in response to this Athenian refusal, Sparta declared war against Athens, and began mobilizing its own forces and those of their allies to make Athens submit. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I put a ton of work into it, and I've already, by the time this one goes out, put in a fair amount of work even on the second episode, which is going to be getting into this big Peloponnesian War and an overview of the first half of it. And then from there, we'll get into this proposal in Athens in the middle of the war to launch an expedition, a major military intervention to the island of Sicily, more than halfway across the Mediterranean. And we'll cover the debates about that expedition and the preparations for it. So stay tuned. That should be coming relatively soon. Not sure exactly when, I make no promises, but should be coming relatively soon. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode and like what I do and get value from it and would like me to continue to be able to keep doing it, please consider contributing and supporting my work. PayPal, Venmo, Bitcoin, Patreon, mailing something to my P.O. box, any or all of the above are greatly appreciated and help keep the DHP in business. Because if I don't have the base of Maslow's hierarchy taken care of, how can I have any ability to keep making Dangerous History podcasts? And one more thing, I'll try to remember to put some Amazon links affiliate links in the show notes for this episode, and they will be to the main sources that I referenced and quoted from and whatever in this episode. But of course, as always, if you follow any of those links to Amazon and get anything, even if it's something that's completely unrelated to any of those books, even if you click on my links and then, order yourself a waterbed or something, I don't know, I'm just pulling something out of nowhere, I'll get a little commission at no cost to you. So it's another way that at no direct cost to you, you can help keep me in business as well. This has been another episode of the Dangerous History Podcast, where as always, I do my best to help you learn the past, understand the present, and prepare for the future.